You paid for her. The young security guard looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I remember the baby crying louder than anything else in that little security office behind Walmart. Loud enough to cut through the buzzing fluorescent lights. Loud enough to drown out the judgment in the room. The woman holding him looked exhausted, pale, thin. Her dark hair was damp from the rain outside, hanging in tangled strands against her cheeks. And sitting on the metal table between us was the evidence of her crime. 2 cans of baby formula, a box of diapers, baby wipes, 1 small jar of applesauce. The total came to $148.22. The older security officer crossed his arms. She concealed the merchandise and attempted to leave the store, he said flatly. That's shoplifting. The woman lowered her eyes. The baby kept crying. I don't know why that sound hit me the way it did. Maybe because I'd spent 20 years in the Navy hearing every kind of human pain imaginable. Maybe because at 42 years old, living alone in a quiet house outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, silence had become something I feared more than noise. Or maybe because the woman didn't look like a criminal. She looked ashamed. There's a difference. I reached into my purse and pulled out my debit card. I'll pay for it. Both guards blinked. The younger one frowned. Ma'am, you don't have to do that. I know. The older guard studied me carefully. You know her. And that was the moment the lie came out. She's my sister. The woman looked up so fast I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just stared at me. I signed the receipt quietly while the cashier behind the desk rang everything up again. $148.22. I remember the number because I lived carefully after retirement. I wasn't wealthy. My Navy pension paid the bills, but not much more. $150 wasn't nothing to me. Still, a hungry baby shouldn't pay for adult mistakes. The older guard finally sighed. All right, he muttered. Take the merchandise and go. The woman clutched the baby tighter against her chest. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice surprised me. Soft. Educated. Not the voice people expected from a homeless woman. Outside, rain drizzled across the Walmart parking lot. The sky had already turned dark, though it was barely 6 in the evening. I walked with her beneath the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. Up close, I noticed more details. Her coat was worn and cheap, but beneath it the collar of her sweater looked expensive once. Her posture was straight despite exhaustion. Her fingernails were clean even though her shoes were soaked through. Military families notice details. It becomes instinct after enough years. You don't have to explain anything to me, I told her. She adjusted the baby against her shoulder. He's teething, she said quietly, almost apologetically. The baby had finally stopped crying. His tiny fist clung to her sleeve. What's his name? Oliver. He's beautiful. Her eyes watered then, just slightly. Not dramatic tears, just the kind people fight hard to hide. For a moment she looked like she wanted to say something more. Instead, she simply extended her hand. My name is Emily. I shook it. Grace. Her hand was freezing cold. You shouldn't have done that, she said softly. I glanced toward the Walmart entrance where people still moved in and out with shopping carts and grocery bags like nothing important had happened. A baby needs formula more than Walmart needs another $150. That almost made her smile. Almost. Then she surprised me again. I'll pay you back someday. I let out a quiet laugh. No, you won't. You don't know me. No, I admitted I don't. Rain tapped lightly against the parked cars around us. A pickup truck rumbled through the lot nearby. For some reason, neither of us moved. Then I noticed something strange. She kept looking over her shoulder. Not casually. Nervously. Like she was afraid someone might appear. You okay? I asked. Her expression changed instantly. Too quickly. The kind of emotional shift people learn after living with fear. I'm fine. I knew that answer. Military women know that answer? We hear it from soldiers after funerals. From wives with bruises hidden beneath makeup. From veterans sitting alone at VFW halls pretending whiskey fixes nightmares. I studied her carefully. You got somewhere safe tonight. She hesitated too long. That told me enough. There's a women's shelter near Bragg Boulevard, I said. Safe place. Good people. She nodded politely, though I could tell she probably wouldn't go. People carrying shame rarely walk toward help. They hide from it. I understood that better than most. My divorce 5 years earlier had nearly hollowed me out. Not because my husband cheated, but because after 20 years of military life I realized I no longer knew who I was without service structure or obligation. Some nights my house felt so quiet it physically hurt. You learn strange things about loneliness after 40. Emily glanced down at Oliver sleeping against her chest. Then she looked back at me. "Why did you say I was your sister?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it honestly before answering. Because nobody deserves to stand alone in a room like that. For the first time, emotion cracked fully across her face. Not relief. Not gratitude. Pain. Deep pain. The kind that had been building for years. She swallowed hard and looked away before she lost control of herself. Then very gently she squeezed my hand once. No dramatic speech. No tears. No promises. Just one quiet gesture from a broken stranger standing in the rain outside Walmart. A few seconds later, she walked away carrying her baby and those plastic grocery bags like they weighed 100 pounds. I watched her disappear across the far end of the parking lot. Not toward the bus stop. Not toward the road. Toward an older silver Honda parked near the edge of the lot. One rear window was covered with cardboard. My chest tightened. She and that baby were living in that car. Emily carefully opened the passenger door and climbed inside with Oliver. The dome light flickered briefly, illuminating her exhausted face one last time, before the car went dark again. Then she was gone. I stood there in the rain much longer than I should have. Something about her bothered me. Not fear. Not pity. Recognition. Like somewhere beneath the dirt, exhaustion and silence. Life had once handed that woman every opportunity imaginable before taking it all away. And I couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't over yet. Not even close. 2 weeks later, somebody knocked on my front door at 8:30 in the morning. Not rang the bell. Knocked. 3 firm hits. Military style. I looked up from my kitchen table, still halfway through my coffee. Outside the window, early October fog hung low across my yard. My old Labrador Duke lifted his head from the rug but didn't bark. That told me whoever stood outside carried authority. Dogs always know. I opened the door expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery driver. Instead, a young man in army dress uniform stood on my porch. Perfect posture. Fresh haircut. White gloves tucked beneath one arm. Ms. Grace Miller. Yes. He handed me a sealed envelope. For you, ma'am. The return address meant nothing to me at first. Whitaker Estate, Raleigh, North Carolina. The soldier gave a respectful nod before walking back toward a black SUV parked beside the curb. Not military issued, private. Expensive. I stood there in my robe and slippers watching the vehicle disappear down my street like something out of an old political thriller. Then I looked down at the envelope again. Heavy cream paper. Embossed seal. Real ink. Whoever sent this had money. A lot of it. Inside was a short handwritten note. Ms. Miller, my family and I would be honored if you would join us for dinner this Friday evening. There is something important we wish to discuss with you personally. Transportation will be provided if desired. Respectfully, Robert Whitaker. Below the signature sat 4 small silver stars embossed into the page. I stared at them for a long moment. 4-star General. I actually laughed under my breath. What in the world? The name finally clicked a few seconds later. General Robert Whitaker. Even retired military people knew the name. Decorated Army Commander. Vidover. Television interviews. Congressional testimony. The kind of man who shook hands with presidents. And somehow, he wanted to have dinner with me. For the next 2 days, I convinced myself it had to be some kind of veterans charity misunderstanding. Maybe a fundraising dinner. Maybe they wanted donations or publicity. There was no possible connection between me and a 4-star general. At least none I could think of. Still, Friday evening arrived. And right at 5 o'clock, another black SUV pulled into my driveway. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door for me like I was some kind of senator's wife. I almost told him I could drive myself. But curiosity had already taken over. The drive to Raleigh lasted nearly an hour and a half. As we left Fayetteville behind, neighborhoods slowly changed. Small homes became gated properties. Pickup trucks became luxury sedans. By the time we turned onto a private road lined with oak trees, I started feeling seriously underdressed. I'd worn my nicest navy blue blazer and pearl earrings. Perfectly respectable for church or dinner at a steakhouse. Not for this place. The estate appeared beyond iron gates lit by stone lanterns. Massive white columns. Perfect landscaping. The kind of mansion old money families passed down for generations. I suddenly wanted to go home. People assume military officers feel comfortable around power. That's not always true. Most veterans I know feel more at ease at diners than mansions. The SUV stopped beneath a covered entrance. A uniformed attendant opened my door. Inside, soft piano music drifted through the house. Somewhere nearby, people spoke quietly over glasses and silverware. I followed another staff member through a hallway lined with military portraits and framed medals. General Whitaker appeared in several of them. Younger, hard-eyed, standing beside presidents and foreign leaders. But one photograph caught my attention immediately. A family portrait. The general. A beautiful brunette woman, likely his late wife. And between them, a younger version of Emily. My footsteps slowed. Number. No way. The staff member opened double doors leading into a large sitting room. And there she was, the homeless woman from Walmart. Except she didn't look homeless anymore. Not even remotely. Her dark hair fell neatly over her shoulders. Her makeup was simple and elegant. The pale silk dress she wore probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to. But it was still her. Same eyes, same sadness underneath them. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Emily smiled softly. "Hello, Grace." I genuinely think my brain stopped working for about 3 seconds. I couldn't even finish the sentence. She stepped closer slowly, almost nervously. "I'm glad you came." I glanced around the enormous room. "What is happening?" Before she could answer, another voice entered calmly behind us. "She's my daughter." I turned. General Robert Whitaker stood near the fireplace. Tall, silver-haired, broad shoulders despite his age. Even in civilian clothes, the man carried himself like command followed him naturally. His eyes settled on me with surprising warmth. "Ms. Miller," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." I recovered enough to shake his hand. His grip was firm but not intimidating. Still, I felt suddenly aware of every scuff mark on my shoes. I think I said carefully, "Somebody owes me an explanation." Emily lowered her gaze immediately. That alone told me everything between them wasn't healed. "Not yet." The general gestured toward the sitting area. "Please sit." A maid brought coffee and quietly disappeared. For a few moments nobody spoke. Then General Whitaker finally exhaled deeply. "My daughter disappeared 3 years ago." The room went silent except for the ticking grandfather clock nearby. "She left after an argument between us," he continued, "and refused all contact afterward." Emily stared down at her hands. I noticed faint tension in her shoulders. Not fear exactly. More like shame. The general's voice softened. After her mother died, Emily struggled more than either of us admitted. He looked toward her carefully. She met a man named Caleb Turner. The name itself seemed to darken the room. He convinced her I cared more about military reputation than her happiness. Emily gave a small bitter laugh. At the time, I believed him. The general nodded sadly. By the time I realized who he truly was, she was already gone. I looked at Emily again, remembering the car in the Walmart parking lot. The cardboard window. The baby formula. "How long were you homeless?" Emily swallowed hard. "About 8 months." 8 months.
Dear God.
The general looked older suddenly. Not powerful. Not famous. Just tired. "We searched everywhere," he said quietly. "Private investigators, veterans networks, police contacts." His eyes moved toward Emily with unmistakable pain. But shame can hide a person better than distance. Emily wiped quickly beneath one eye. "I didn't know how to come home after everything." The room fell quiet again. Then General Whitaker looked directly at me. 2 weeks ago, he said my daughter finally called me. Emily's eyes met mine. She told me about Walmart. I felt my face warm slightly. It wasn't a big deal. The general shook his head immediately. "Yes, ma'am, it was." His voice thickened just slightly. "For 3 years. My daughter believed she was too ashamed to come home." Emily finally broke then. Not loudly. Just silent tears sliding down her face. And the general looked at me with the expression of a father who had nearly lost his child forever. "You gave her the courage to walk back through my front door." I stayed at the Whitaker estate nearly 4 hours that night. Long enough for the formal atmosphere to slowly disappear. Long enough to realize General Robert Whitaker wasn't inviting senators and wealthy donors over for dinner every evening. The man was lonely. That surprised me more than the mansion. Power has a strange way of isolating people. I'd seen it happen to high-ranking officers during my Navy years. The more respected they became publicly, the fewer people spoke honestly around them privately. By 9:30, the staff had mostly disappeared into the background. Emily had changed into jeans and a cream-colored sweater, looking less like somebody from a magazine cover and more like the exhausted young mother I'd met outside Walmart. Oliver slept upstairs in the nursery, and the general sat across from me holding a coffee mug with both hands like he was trying to warm something deeper than his fingers. "I owe you the full truth," Emily said quietly. I leaned back in the leather chair. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes," she said, "I do." The general didn't interrupt. That told me he already knew what was coming. Emily stared into her coffee for several seconds before speaking again. When my mother died, everything changed in this house. Her voice remained calm, but barely. My father buried himself in work. I buried myself in pretending I was fine. The general lowered his eyes. That kind of guilt doesn't disappear with rank, Emily continued softly. I met Caleb 6 months later. I already disliked the man and I hadn't even seen his face. He was charming, she admitted. Funny, confident. Nothing like the military men I grew up around. I nodded slowly. I'd heard versions of this story before. Not from wealthy women specifically. From lonely women. Those are different things. At first, she continued, he made me feel understood. Her mouth tightened slightly. Then little things started changing. The general quietly stood and walked toward the fireplace, listening without speaking. Emily kept going. He didn't like my father. That feeling was mutual, the general muttered dryly. Despite the heaviness in the room, I almost smiled. Emily did too, faintly. Caleb used to tell me my father only cared about image, she said. That military families don't know how to love normally. I noticed her hands trembling slightly now. He kept saying, wealthy people only help others when cameras are watching. I leaned forward carefully. That's how emotional isolation starts. Emily looked at me immediately. You understand it. Unfortunately, I'd spent enough years around military spouses, abuse shelters, and struggling veterans to recognize manipulation almost instantly. Real predators rarely begin with cruelty. They begin with comfort. He slowly pushed everybody out of my life, Emily admitted. Friends first, then extended family, then eventually my father. General Whitaker remained standing by the fireplace staring at the flames. I warned her about him, he said quietly. Emily nodded. I know. The general's jaw tightened. But I warned her like a commander, he admitted. Not like a father. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after that. That sentence alone explained years of damage. Emily exhaled shakily. The night I left home, she said we had a horrible fight. The general closed his eyes briefly. He told me if I walked out with Caleb, I was making the biggest mistake of my life. And I told him I hated him. Silence settled over the room. I looked between them and suddenly understood something painful. Neither one had stopped loving the other. They'd simply stopped knowing how to reach each other. Emily wiped beneath one eye. I thought Caleb loved me enough to protect me from everything. Her laugh this time sounded hollow. Turns out he mainly needed somebody to pay his bills. The general finally sat back down heavily. He drained her savings within a year, he said, then began opening accounts in her name. I frowned. Fraud. Emily nodded weakly. Small things at first, credit cards, loans, excuses. Then came the part I'd already suspected. He started getting angry after Oliver was born. Her voice nearly disappeared on that sentence. I kept mine calm. Did he hit you? Emily hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. The general's face hardened instantly, though he stayed silent. Military fathers know violence even when they can't stop it. Not at first, Emily whispered. I felt anger rise slowly inside my chest. Cold anger. The kind that settles quietly instead of exploding. Eventually, she continued, he stopped pretending completely. The room felt smaller now. He'd disappear for days, gamble money, scream at me for asking questions. She swallowed hard. Then one night he told me Oliver and I were ruining his life. The general looked like somebody had physically punched him. Emily stared down at her lap. A week later, he left. No dramatic tears. No breakdown. That's how you know pain has lasted too long. People over 60 watching this story would understand that kind of exhaustion deeply. Life eventually teaches you there are wounds too old for theatrics. Why didn't you come home then? I asked gently. Emily's eyes filled again. Because my father warned me. The general flinched almost invisibly. I thought if I came back... She whispered he'd look at me and say, I told you so. The old man spoke immediately. I would never, but I believed you would. That silence afterward felt heavier than any argument. I thought about the silver Honda in the Walmart parking lot, the cardboard-covered window, the crying baby. And suddenly I understood something important. Emily Whitaker hadn't become homeless because she lacked money. She became homeless because shame convinced her she no longer deserved love. That realization made me angrier than Caleb himself. I leaned forward slightly. Where is he now? Both of them looked at me. Caleb, I clarified. Emily shook her head. I don't know, but the general answered quietly. I do. That surprised her. The general's expression darkened. I had investigators continue searching after Emily came home. Of course he did. Men, like Robert Whitaker, didn't stop protecting their families simply because time passed. He's currently living outside Durham, the general continued. Different girlfriend, different lies. I nodded slowly. Predators repeat patterns. Always. Emily looked suddenly anxious. Dad, but the general's eyes remained on me. He's done this before. How many women, I asked? At least 4 we know about. I sat back carefully. There it was. Not just a bad man, a practiced one. The general folded his hands together. Legally, he said calmly, there's very little we can currently prove. I looked toward Emily. She still carried guilt in every movement. Still blamed herself for surviving him. And that bothered me deeply. Because people like Caleb only survive when decent people stay quiet out of embarrassment. I spent 20 years serving beside good men and women who protected strangers they'd never meet again. I wasn't about to sit quietly while some coward continued destroying vulnerable women. I looked directly at Emily. Listen to me carefully. She met my eyes. Being deceived by evil does not make you weak. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. Then I looked toward the general. And men like Caleb Turner only survive because nobody finally stands up and says enough. The old soldier stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly, for the first time all evening, General Robert Whitaker smiled. The first thing I learned after 20 years in the Navy was this. Real predators count on exhaustion. They don't target strong people because they enjoy challenge. They target wounded people because wounded people apologize while being robbed. That thought stayed with me all week after my dinner at the Whitaker estate. I tried pretending the situation wasn't my business. I really did. I walked Duke every morning through my neighborhood outside Fayetteville. I attended my veterans support meetings twice that week. I changed the oil in my old Ford Explorer myself because retirement teaches you strange forms of stubborn independence. But every quiet moment brought me back to Emily sitting in that Walmart security office holding her crying baby. And every time I remembered her apologizing for stealing formula, I got angry all over again. By Thursday afternoon, I finally called somebody I trusted. Frank Delaney, retired military police, 68 years old, twice divorced, permanent bad attitude, one of the most reliable men I'd ever known. He answered on the 3rd ring. Well, he grumbled either somebody died or you need help moving furniture. I need information. That's usually worse. An hour later, we sat inside a diner near Ramsey Street drinking terrible coffee beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Frank listened quietly while I explained everything. The Walmart incident. Emily. General Whitaker. Caleb Turner. When I finished, Frank leaned back in the booth with a low whistle. You sure know how to find peaceful retirement. I'm serious. I know you are. He stirred cream into his coffee. That's the problem. Frank had spent decades investigating domestic abuse around military communities. He recognized the pattern immediately. Guy isolates wealthy daughter, drains finances, moves on to emotional abuse. He shook his head. Classic parasite. You heard the name before? Not personally, but men like him always leave breadcrumbs. Frank still had friends in local law enforcement across North Carolina. By the following Monday, he called me back. Your boyfriend's dirty, he said immediately. Not my boyfriend. You know what I mean. I grabbed a notepad from the kitchen counter. What did you find? Frank exhaled heavily. 3 prior fraud complaints, 2 dismissed, 1 unresolved. My stomach tightened. What kind of fraud? Romance scams mostly. Small-scale manipulation. Borrowed money that never returned. False business investments. Violence. Nothing convicted. That answer bothered me more than if he'd said yes. Because men like Caleb rarely stop before violence. They simply get smarter about hiding it. Frank continued. He changes jobs constantly, uses different addresses, couple aliases floating around too. Professional drifter. Exactly what I expected. And here's the interesting part, Frank added. One woman filed a protective order 3 years ago, then suddenly withdrew it. Fear. I knew the pattern. Can you get me her name? Grace. Frank. He sighed. You're really doing this? No, I said quietly. I'm finishing it. 3 days later, I drove to Durham to meet the woman who'd once filed that protective order. Her name was Linda Perez, 56 years old, former nurse. We met at a small coffee shop near Duke Regional Hospital. At first, she barely wanted to speak about Caleb at all. Then I mentioned Emily. Everything changed. Linda stared into her tea for nearly a minute before speaking. He always knows who to choose, she said softly. I stayed quiet. He picked me after my husband died. There it was again. Loneliness. Grief. People like Caleb can smell emotional vulnerability the way sharks smell blood. Linda gave a humorless laugh. At first, he made me feel visible again. I nodded slowly. Then he started borrowing money. Small amounts, she shrugged bitterly. then bigger ones. Did he hurt you? She hesitated. That answer again. Yes. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm. Linda rubbed her wrist unconsciously. He never punched my face, she whispered. Men like him know exactly where not to leave bruises. My jaw tightened hard enough to hurt. And the police? They needed proof. That sentence right there explained half the tragedy in America. Proof. As though fear itself isn't evidence enough sometimes, Linda looked at me carefully. Why are you asking now? Because he almost destroyed somebody else. Almost. I thought about Emily returning home. About Oliver sleeping safely upstairs. Not this time. Linda stared at me for several seconds. Then something softened in her expression. You military? Retired Navy. She smiled faintly. That explains the eyes. The eyes. You look calm while planning something dangerous. I actually laughed at that. Maybe because she wasn't wrong. That Friday evening, I drove back to the Whitaker estate for the first time since dinner. Emily opened the door herself. She looked healthier already. Still fragile, but healthier. The general joined us in the library a few minutes later. I handed him a folder. Inside sat copies of everything Frank helped uncover. Fraud complaints, addresses, witness statements, patterns. The old general flipped through the pages silently. His face hardened more with every document. Emily sat beside me reading over my shoulder. Halfway through, she suddenly whispered, "Oh my God." One of Caleb's former girlfriends looked barely older than 25. Another had 2 children. Another had filed bankruptcy. The general closed the folder carefully. How many women? Emily asked weakly. At least 4 confirmed, I said. Her face crumpled with guilt. I should have stopped him. No, I answered firmly. You survived him. There's a difference. The general nodded slowly in agreement. Then he surprised me. What do you intend to do now? Not what should we do. What do you intend to do? Military people understand initiative. I leaned back calmly. I want Caleb scared. Emily looked startled. The general did not. I'm listening, he said. I folded my hands together. Men like him operate through confidence. They believe nobody will challenge them publicly. The general's eyes narrowed slightly. And I think it's time he realizes somebody finally will. Sunday night, Emily and I drove together to a bar outside Durham called Rusty Nail Tavern. According to Frank, Caleb practically lived there lately. The place smelled like stale beer and old cigarettes. Country music hummed softly from a jukebox near the pool tables. Emily looked nervous beside me. You don't have to do this, I reminded her quietly. Yes, she whispered, I do. Then the front door opened, and Caleb Turner walked inside. Tall, good-looking in a cheap, rehearsed kind of way. Confident grin. Leather jacket. The kind of man who spent his entire life learning how to mirror whatever women wanted to see. At first, he didn't recognize Emily. Then he did. I watched the exact moment his confidence cracked. Not because she looked wealthy. Because she looked protected. Healthy. No longer isolated. Caleb slowly approached our table. Well, he said carefully, didn't expect to see you again. Emily's hands trembled slightly beneath the table. I noticed. So did Caleb. Predators always notice fear. Then his eyes moved toward me. And who's this? I stood calmly. Grace Miller. He smirked faintly. Friend of yours? No, Emily answered quietly. Family. Something dangerous flickered behind his smile then. He looked me over dismissively. You military? Retired Navy. He chuckled under his breath. That explains the attitude. I smiled politely. That explains yours too. His expression tightened. For the first time all evening, Caleb looked uncertain. Good. I stepped slightly closer. You picked the wrong woman to prey on, I said softly. Then I held his gaze long enough for him to understand something very clearly. He wasn't dealing with frightened victims anymore. Not this time. Caleb Turner stopped smiling after that night at Rusty Nail Tavern. You could see it in his eyes. Men like him survive by controlling the emotional temperature in every room they enter. Charm when needed, intimidation when useful, sympathy when cornered. But uncertainty, that rattles them, especially when they realize somebody finally sees them clearly. For the next several days, Caleb started calling Emily repeatedly. At first, the voicemail sounded smooth. Hey, Em. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Then slightly irritated. You really bringing strangers into our business now? Then angry. You think your daddy can scare me? Emily listened to the messages sitting beside me in the Whitaker Library one afternoon, while Oliver played quietly on the carpet. By the 4th voicemail, her hands were shaking again. I reached over calmly and muted the phone. You don't owe fear your attention. She nodded weakly. The general stood near the window listening silently. I'd come to understand something about Robert Whitaker over the past week. The man carried guilt like a second spine. Not because Emily suffered, because he believed he failed to protect her from suffering. That burden ages fathers faster than war ever could. He contacted you directly, the general asked carefully. Emily nodded. He found my number somehow. The general's jaw tightened. I'll have it changed immediately. No, I interrupted gently. Both of them looked at me. Let him keep calling. Emily frowned slightly. Why? Because desperate people make mistakes. The general studied me quietly. Again, that old soldier recognition passed between us. He understood strategy. By then, Frank had already connected us with a detective in Durham named Carla Benson, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, no patience for manipulators. Turns out Caleb had been operating closer to legal disaster than he realized. 3 women besides Emily finally agreed to provide statements. Linda Perez, a divorced schoolteacher from Greensboro, and a young widow named Megan Hall, who'd lost nearly $40,000 after Caleb convinced her to invest in a fake trucking business. Every story sounded painfully similar. Charm, isolation, dependency, fear, then abandonment. Detective Benson spread the files across her desk when I met her downtown. Guys like this usually slip through, she admitted. Victims feel embarrassed, cases stay fragmented. But not anymore. No, she agreed quietly. Not anymore. She tapped one folder. The financial fraud finally gives us traction. What about the abuse? Benson sighed. Harder to prosecute. That answer frustrated me, though it didn't surprise me. America still struggles understanding emotional abuse unless bruises become visible enough for photographs. Before I left, Benson looked at me carefully. You know, most people walk away from situations like this. I shrugged. Most people didn't watch a mother steal baby formula because she ran out of options. The detective nodded slowly. Fair point. 3 nights later, Caleb made his biggest mistake. He contacted another woman, not knowing police were already monitoring him. According to Detective Benson later, Caleb attempted convincing the woman to co-sign a vehicle loan using falsified employment paperwork. Fraud. Documented. Recorded. Enough for an arrest warrant. Frank called me at 6:15 the following morning. They're picking him up today. I sat quietly at my kitchen table gripping the phone. Not excitement. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because predators rarely stop voluntarily. They escalate until somebody finally forces the world to see them clearly. Where, I asked? Apartment complex outside Durham. I hesitated. Then, Emily should be there. Frank went silent briefly. You sure? Yes. Some endings matter. By 10:30 that morning, we stood across the street from a faded brick apartment building while unmarked police vehicles waited nearby. The sky hung gray and cold overhead. Emily stood beside her father wearing a long wool coat, nervously twisting her gloves together. Oliver stayed back at the estate with a nanny. General Whitaker looked calm externally, but I noticed his fists opening and closing slowly beside him. Combat veterans recognize adrenaline in each other immediately. You okay? I asked quietly. The old general gave a short breath of a laugh. I've negotiated military operations with less stress than this. That nearly made me smile. Then Detective Benson's voice crackled through a nearby radio. Target exiting. Caleb stepped outside holding a paper coffee cup. Completely relaxed. Completely unaware. For one brief second I saw the exact man Emily once fell in love with. Confident. Attractive. Easy smile. Then police moved in from both sides. The coffee hit the pavement first. What the hell is this? Caleb snapped, jerking backward. Detective Benson approached calmly. Caleb Turner, you are under arrest for financial fraud and identity-related offenses. His entire demeanor changed instantly. Not fear. Calculation. His eyes scanned every direction, searching for escape advantage manipulation. Then he saw Emily, standing beside her father, and beside me. For the first time since this began, Caleb looked genuinely shaken. Emily? No, she said immediately. Her voice surprised even her. Strong. Steady. The officers moved closer while Benson read charges. Caleb ignored them completely. His eyes stayed locked on Emily. I can explain everything. Classic. Always explanation before accountability. Emily stared at him quietly for several seconds. Then something remarkable happened. The fear disappeared from her face. Not because Caleb changed. Because she finally understood she wasn't alone anymore. You said nobody would ever want me back, she told him softly. Caleb's expression tightened. You manipulated me, she continued. You isolated me. You made me ashamed of needing help. People passing nearby slowed to watch. Apartment windows opened. Nobody interrupted. Emily took one slow breath. But you know what you were wrong about. Caleb remained silent. My father never stopped loving me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw General Whitaker lower his head slightly. That sentence hit him hard. Caleb glanced toward the general with open resentment. Then toward me. Recognition finally settled fully across his face. Not of power, of failure. He understood something now. Emily had escaped him. Completely. You turned her against me, he snapped at me bitterly. I looked at him calmly. No, I answered. You did that yourself. One officer stepped forward with handcuffs. Caleb's confidence vanished completely then. No charm. No swagger. Just anger. Small men always look smallest when control disappears. As police guided him toward the vehicle, he twisted once more toward Emily. You think these people care about you now, he spat. Emily surprised all of us with her response. They cared about me when I had nothing. That shut him up. Completely. The car door closed. And just like that, the man who spent years controlling frightened women disappeared behind reinforced glass. Gone. The parking lot fell quiet afterward. General Whitaker exhaled heavily beside me. Not victory. Release. Emily stood motionless for several seconds, watching the police cars drive away. Then suddenly she started crying. Not dramatic sobbing. Just deep, exhausted tears from somebody finally setting down years of fear. Her father stepped toward her carefully, almost cautiously, like he worried she might still pull away. But this time, Emily moved first. She wrapped both arms around him and buried her face against his chest like a little girl again. And for the first time since I met him, General Robert Whitaker broke down crying too. 3 weeks after Caleb's arrest, I returned to the Whitaker estate for Sunday dinner. This time the gates didn't intimidate me. Funny how quickly a mansion starts feeling smaller once you've watched the people inside cry. The air had turned colder across North Carolina by then. Orange leaves scattered across the long driveway as I parked beside the front entrance. Somewhere in the distance, wind moved softly through the oak trees surrounding the property. For the first time since meeting them, the house didn't feel heavy. Still quiet. Still formal in places. But lighter somehow. Healing changes the atmosphere of a home. You can feel it before anybody even speaks. Emily opened the door before I knocked. You brought pie, she said immediately, smiling at the aluminum tray in my hands. Store-bought, I warned her. Perfect. Dad burns everything except military coffee. I heard that General Whitaker called from somewhere deeper in the house. I laughed before stepping inside. The general appeared a few seconds later wearing jeans and a dark sweater instead of a suit jacket. Without the polished public image, he looked more his age now. Older. Softer. Human. And honestly, I think that was healthier for him. Grace, he said warmly. Good to see you. He hugged me. Not a handshake. Not military politeness. A real hug. That probably would have shocked half the Pentagon 20 years ago. The smell of roast chicken drifted from the kitchen while soft jazz played somewhere nearby. Upstairs I could hear Oliver fussing faintly through a baby monitor. Normal family sounds. Simple things. The kind many people take for granted until life nearly destroys them. Dinner itself wasn't fancy despite the setting. Roasted vegetables, chicken, mashed potatoes, sweet tea. Honestly, it reminded me more of a church potluck than some wealthy formal gathering. And that was exactly why I liked it. Halfway through dinner, Emily suddenly looked toward her father. I told Grace what happened after Mom died. The general set down his fork slowly. All of it. Most of it. A shadow crossed his expression. For a moment I worried the old tension might return. Instead he nodded quietly. I suppose it's fair she knows my failures too. Emily immediately shook her head. Dad, no. He gave her a gentle look. She deserves honesty. The room grew quieter then. Outside wind brushed softly against the windows. The general folded his hands together carefully. When my wife died, he began slowly. I didn't know how to stay a father. Nobody interrupted. I knew how to command troops, solve crises, lead operations. His voice tightened slightly. But grief inside your own home feels different. Emily stared down at her plate. The general continued quietly. I thought structure would protect us. That sentence alone explained so much. Military men from his generation often survived life through discipline. Emotion came second, sometimes third. I pushed Emily too hard after the funeral, he admitted. I mistook obedience for healing. Emily's eyes filled immediately. You were hurting too. Yes, he said softly, but I was still your father. Silence settled around the table. Not uncomfortable silence. Truthful silence. The kind families reach only after years of avoiding difficult conversations. Then the general looked directly at his daughter. "I owe you an apology." Emily blinked rapidly. "I should have listened more," he said, and commanded less. That one nearly broke me. Because older American audiences understand something younger people often miss. Real apologies become harder with age, not easier. Especially from proud men. Emily finally wiped beneath her eyes. "I thought you only cared about reputation." The general's expression crumpled slightly. "Emily," he whispered, "I searched every homeless shelter in 3 states. The room went still. He looked away briefly before continuing. "When winter came," his voice roughened, "I used to wake up at night wondering if you and Oliver were cold somewhere." Emily covered her mouth immediately. I quietly looked down at my plate to give them privacy. Some grief deserves dignity. Then I heard a chair scrape softly. Emily stood and walked around the table toward her father. This time there was no hesitation between them at all. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, and General Whitaker held on to his daughter like a man finally allowing himself to stop being strong. I glanced toward the kitchen window while they cried together quietly. Not because I felt awkward, because moments like that should remain partly private even when witnessed. After a while, Emily laughed weakly through tears. Mom would yell at us for ruining dinner. That finally broke the tension completely. The general smiled. "She'd yell at me specifically. She always yelled at you specifically. That's because your mother enjoyed impossible tasks." For the first time since meeting them, the sound of genuine family laughter filled the house. And Lord, that house needed it. Later that evening after dinner dishes were cleared away, I sat on the back patio wrapped in a blanket against the cold. The estate overlooked a quiet lake reflecting moonlight across dark water. Peaceful. A little lonely too. I heard footsteps behind me. Then someone handed me a fresh cup of coffee. A man around my age sat down nearby. Tall, gray at the temples, kind eyes. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Depends," I replied. "Are you another retired general?" He laughed. "No, ma'am. Army surgeon." "Still dangerous." "Fair point." His name was Daniel Harper, widowed, family friend of the Whitakers. Calm in the steady way older doctors often become after years around pain. We talked quietly for almost an hour. About military life, retirement, bad knees, how grocery stores somehow became exhausting after 60. Nothing dramatic, just comfortable conversation. At one point he smiled at me over his coffee cup. "You know," he said, "Robert hasn't spoken this peacefully in years." I looked through the patio doors where the general sat inside holding Oliver while Emily folded baby blankets nearby. A real family scene. Simple, warm. "He just needed his daughter home," I said softly. Dr. Harper nodded, and she needed somebody kind enough to help her before pride killed the chance. That stayed with me, because pride destroys more families in America than poverty ever will. Before I left that night, Emily walked me to my car. Cold air drifted through the driveway while porch lights glowed softly behind us. She hugged me tightly before I opened the door. "You saved my life," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "Number." She frowned slightly. I smiled. "You decided to come home. That part was yours." Emily looked toward the house where her father stood watching from the front doorway holding Oliver against his shoulder. Then she looked back at me. "You gave me the courage to do it." Winter arrived quietly that year, not with dramatic snowstorms or icy highways. Just cold mornings, bare trees, and the kind of silence that settles gently over North Carolina after Thanksgiving. By December, life had changed for all of us in ways I never could have imagined the night I walked into Walmart for dog food and coffee filters. Funny how ordinary moments become turning points. Emily had moved into a smaller guest house on the Whitaker property instead of staying inside the mansion itself. She said she needed space to rebuild her life honestly rather than disappear back into privilege. I respected that. Some people survive hardship only to spend the rest of their lives pretending it never happened. Emily chose differently. She started attending counseling twice a week, not because anybody forced her, because she finally stopped feeling ashamed of needing help. That matters more than people realize, especially for older generations raised to believe pain should stay private. General Whitaker changed too. Not overnight. Men in their 70s rarely transform dramatically, but slowly, visibly, he softened. I saw it in little things. He stopped taking phone calls during family dinners. Started spending mornings pushing Oliver's stroller around the lake near the estate. Even his staff seemed less tense around him. One afternoon I arrived unexpectedly and found the old general sitting cross-legged on the living room floor while Oliver climbed across his shoulders wearing toy aviator goggles. A 4-star army general reduced to a human jungle gym. Life humbles everybody eventually. And honestly, that's probably healthy. Caleb Turner remained in county jail awaiting trial. Turns out Detective Benson's investigation uncovered far more financial fraud than anyone initially realized. 5 confirmed victims became 7, then 9. The district attorney eventually contacted Emily personally. Apparently, several women came forward only after hearing somebody else finally stood against him publicly. That's another truth people don't discuss enough. Courage spreads, so does silence. One afternoon in late January, Emily and I drove together to a women's shelter in Durham, carrying donated coats, formula, and diapers funded quietly by the Whitaker Foundation. No cameras, no publicity, just help. The shelter director recognized Emily from the news coverage surrounding Caleb's arrest, but graciously said nothing about it. Inside, exhausted mothers sat beside tired children under fluorescent lights, humming softly overhead. The place smelled faintly of soup detergent and old carpet. Human survival. Emily grew unusually quiet while unloading supplies. "You okay?" I asked gently. She nodded at first, then stopped. That used to be me. I followed her gaze toward a young mother rocking a crying infant near the corner of the room. The woman looked overwhelmed beyond words. "I remember being so tired," Emily whispered. "I stopped feeling human." There was no self-pity in her voice anymore. Just memory. Then something happened I'll never forget. Emily walked over quietly and knelt beside the young mother. Not as a wealthy donor, not as General Whitaker's daughter, just as another woman who understood. A few minutes later, both women were talking softly while Emily held the baby so the exhausted mother could finally eat her dinner with 2 free hands. That image stayed with me. Because healing becomes real the moment suffering turns into compassion instead of bitterness. On the drive home, Emily stared out the passenger window for a long time before speaking. "You know what scares me most?" "What?" "That I almost never came home. I kept my eyes on the road. But you did. Only because somebody treated me like I still mattered." Her voice cracked slightly then. "You didn't know who I was, Grace." "No," I said softly. "I knew exactly who you were." She looked at me confused. I smiled faintly. A mother trying to feed her baby. That answer made her cry quietly all the way back to Raleigh. By early spring, the Whitaker Foundation officially opened a small assistance program for struggling mothers escaping abusive situations. General Whitaker insisted on naming it after his late wife. Emily personally volunteered there twice a week. And me, well, I somehow became the unofficial grandmother figure for half the staff, despite repeatedly insisting I was far too young for that title. Life's funny that way. Dr. Daniel Harper still called occasionally too, usually pretending he had medical questions about my terrible diet choices before asking whether I wanted dinner afterward. At our age, romance looks less dramatic and far more practical. Honestly, I prefer it. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after the Walmart incident, I stopped at that same store again. Different cashier, different customers, same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As I loaded groceries onto the conveyor belt, I noticed a young woman a few lanes over counting dollar bills anxiously beside a cart, holding diapers and baby formula. Her card had apparently been declined. The cashier looked uncomfortable. People behind her sighed impatiently, and suddenly I felt that familiar ache in my chest. The woman looked exhausted, embarrassed, alone. Before I could move, though, something surprising happened. An older cashier quietly reached into her own wallet and handed money to the woman. "No baby leaves hungry on my shift," the cashier said simply. The young mother immediately burst into tears. And standing there beside my shopping cart, I smiled. Because kindness works that way sometimes. It keeps traveling, from one tired soul to another, long after the original moment has passed. That night, sitting on my porch with Duke asleep beside my chair, I thought about how close Emily came to disappearing forever beneath shame, fear, and pride. And I thought about how many people around us carry invisible battles every single day. The veteran drinking coffee alone at sunrise. The widow pretending she's fine after 40 years of marriage suddenly end. The struggling parent choosing between rent and groceries. The old man too proud to admit he's lonely. Most people are carrying far more pain than they show. That's why kindness matters. Not performative kindness. Not social media kindness, real kindness. The kind nobody sees except the person drowning. Because sometimes, one small act doesn't just change a moment. It gives somebody the courage to come home again. And if this story meant something to you tonight, maybe share it with somebody who needs that reminder too. That people can still choose compassion. That families can heal. And that no one is ever too broken to deserve another chance. That night at Walmart, I thought I was only buying baby formula. I never imagined. I was helping a daughter find her way home. The moment the room went quiet, I knew my younger sister's marriage was hanging by a thread. My brother-in-law Trevor still had half a grin on his face like he thought the whole thing was a joke. Across the Thanksgiving table, his father, a retired Marine colonel with silver hair and hands thick from decades of service, was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost walk through the front door. "Boy," he said slowly. Not loudly, not angrily. Worse. The kind of voice older military men use when they already know someone has crossed a line they can't uncross. Apologize now. You could hear the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. My sister Denise stopped cutting the pecan pie. One of the grandkids dropped a fork onto the hardwood floor. Trevor blinked twice, confused, like he couldn't understand why the temperature in the room had suddenly fallen 20 degrees. 10 seconds earlier, he'd been laughing at me. Laughing hard. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" I remember the smell of turkey and brown sugar glaze hanging in the air when he said it. Everybody around the table had chuckled politely, the kind of laugh families use when they know something is rude but don't want to make things uncomfortable during the holidays. I'd set my glass down carefully. "Try again." Trevor smirked wider. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" And I answered him the same way I might have commented on the weather. "Top Gun instructor." That was when his father froze. Not because of the movies, not because of the name itself, but because men like Richard Hayes knew exactly what it took to earn that title. And suddenly, after 40 years of being invisible in my own family, everybody at that table was looking at me differently. Funny how fast people can rearrange their opinion of you once they realize you were never weak to begin with. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old, retired Navy, and until that Thanksgiving dinner in Northern Virginia, most of my family thought I'd spent my military career pushing paperwork behind a desk somewhere. Honestly, I'd let them think it. It was easier that way. The trouble with accomplishments is that people often treat them like ownership. The minute relatives discover you've done something difficult, they rewrite history. Suddenly they supported you all along. Suddenly they always believed in you. But that wasn't how my story went. I drove to Denise's house that Thanksgiving through cold November rain with an overnight bag in the trunk and every intention of keeping my head down for 48 hours. Her subdivision looked like every upper-middle-class neighborhood built outside Washington during the late 90s, brick homes, trimmed lawns, SUVs lined neatly along curbs. The kind of place where people talked about service more than sacrifice. Denise greeted me warmly enough at the front door, though there was always a stiffness between us that neither of us knew how to fix anymore. "Evie," she said, hugging me lightly, "long drive. About 4 hours. You should have flown." I almost smiled at that. After 30 years around military aviation, commercial flying had become the one thing I avoided whenever possible. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon candles and roasted turkey. Football played softly from the living room television, while grandchildren raced through the hallway wearing paper turkey hats they'd made at school. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like visiting a version of America I'd spent my life protecting but never quite belonging to. Trevor stood near the kitchen island holding a beer bottle. Big man. Loud personality. The kind who filled silence because he couldn't tolerate it. "Hey," he called when he saw me. Denise's mysterious sister finally made it. "Mysterious?" I asked. "Well, sure," he laughed. 30 years in the military and nobody knows what you actually did." I took off my coat slowly. Most people never asked. Richard Hayes was sitting quietly near the fireplace when I walked in. Straight posture despite being well into his 70s. One glance told me everything I needed to know about him, old-school Marine Korea veteran father, probably Vietnam himself. Men like him recognized military habits the way musicians recognize rhythm. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. Respectful. Observant. Not performative. That was the first moment all evening I relaxed. Dinner itself started pleasantly enough. Denise had gone all-out sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from an actual recipe instead of a can. The grandchildren argued over whipped cream, while Trevor dominated every conversation within reach. He talked about real estate investments, gas prices, politics, how nobody wants to work anymore. I mostly listened. That's another habit the Navy teaches you. Quiet people hear everything. At some point, the conversation turned toward military service after one of the boys asked whether I'd ever been in a dogfight like Maverick. Trevor laughed before I could answer. "Oh, come on," he said. "Your Aunt Evelyn wasn't flying fighter jets." I shrugged lightly. "Why not?" "Because you're too calm." The table laughed. I did too, a little. Not because it was funny. Because most people think dangerous people look dangerous. Truth is, the deadliest men and women I ever met usually sounded like accountants. Trevor leaned back in his chair. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" And there it was. Not cruel enough to cause a scene. Just disrespectful enough to establish a pecking order. I saw Denise tense immediately. She knew her husband's mouth could outrun his judgment sometimes. I set my water glass down. "Try again." He grinned. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" I looked directly at him. "Top Gun instructor." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrives when a room suddenly realizes it misunderstood someone completely. Richard Hayes stopped moving altogether. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me. Then he asked the question nobody else in the room understood enough to ask. "Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program." I nodded once. His expression changed immediately. Not excitement. Recognition. The grandchildren looked confused while Trevor laughed nervously. "Wait, seriously." Richard never took his eyes off me. "Boy," he said quietly. Trevor turned toward his father. "Apologize now." Trevor blinked. "Dad, I was kidding." "No," Richard replied. "You were disrespecting somebody who earned more respect by breakfast than you've earned in your whole life. You could have carved the tension with a butter knife." Denise stared at me like she was meeting me for the first time. And the strange thing was, maybe she was. Richard Hayes followed me into the kitchen about 20 minutes later, while the rest of the family pretended to watch football in the living room. That's the thing about uncomfortable family moments. Nobody ever addresses them directly at first. Americans my age were raised to smooth things over quietly, even when the floorboards underneath the family were cracking. I stood at the sink rinsing dishes while Denise hovered nearby pretending to organize leftovers. Every few seconds she glanced toward me, then away again. Like she wanted to ask something but didn't know where to begin. Richard stopped beside the counter. "You flew Tomcats?" he asked softly. I nodded once at first. "And later?" "Super Hornets." He let out a low whistle under his breath. Not dramatic. Just honest admiration from one old military soul to another. "You must have caught the tail end of Cold War training." "Barely." He folded his arms. Women weren't exactly welcomed into that pipeline back then. "No," I said, "we weren't." Denise finally turned around. "Wait," she said carefully. "You actually flew combat aircraft?" I dried my hands with a towel before answering. "Yes." The room behind us had gone quieter. Trevor was still in there, but now the television volume had magically dropped low enough for everyone to overhear. Families are funny that way. Suddenly I could feel 40 years of assumptions shifting around inside that house like furniture being rearranged. Denise leaned against the counter. "You never told us any of this." I looked at her for a moment. "You never asked." That landed harder than I intended. Her face softened, immediately hurt, mixing with guilt. And right then I almost regretted saying it. Almost. Because the truth was my family stopped being curious about me a very long time ago. Back when we were girls growing up in Ohio, Denise was sunlight. Blonde hair, easy smile, cheerleader ribbons hanging from her bedroom mirror. Everybody loved Denise because Denise made life simple. I was the difficult one. The quiet one. The girl lying on the garage roof at night memorizing aircraft silhouettes while other girls passed notes about boys. Our father used to shake his head every time I brought home another aviation magazine from the library. "You ought to focus on something practical," he'd tell me. Flying is practical. For a man. Richard pulled a chair out slowly and sat down at the kitchen table. "You mind if I ask what your call sign was?" That got Denise's attention immediately. "Call sign," she repeated. I smiled faintly despite myself. Military families understood what that meant. Civilian families usually thought it was something Hollywood invented. I hesitated. Richard noticed. If it's classified, forget I asked. It's not classified, I said quietly, just old. He waited. I looked down at the dish towel in my hands. Iron Widow. For a second, Richard didn't move. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and muttered one quiet word under his breath. Jesus. From the living room came Trevor's voice. What does that mean? Richard looked toward him. It means your Aunt Evelyn trained fighter pilots during some very dangerous years. I still don't get why everybody's acting like she landed on the moon. That did it. Richard stood so fast his chair scraped hard across the tile floor. Because people died learning those skills, he snapped. The whole house went silent again. Trevor stared at his father in shock. I could tell this wasn't how their family normally operated. Richard probably wasn't a man who raised his voice often. Which meant when he did, it mattered. He pointed toward Trevor. You think military aviation is some kind of joke? You think instructors are glorified babysitters? Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Dad, I said I was kidding. No, Richard replied sharply. You were mocking somebody because you assumed she was small enough to mock. Denise stepped between them gently. Okay, she said softly. Everybody calm down. I hated the direction things were going. Not because Trevor didn't deserve embarrassment. Because public humiliation rarely changes people for the better. It just makes them defensive. I'm not upset, I said. Trevor looked at me suspiciously. Then why didn't you tell anyone who you were? That question hung in the kitchen longer than the others had. Why didn't I? The answer wasn't simple. Because when I graduated near the top of flight school, my father said they were lowering standards. Because when I made instructor, one uncle joked I was probably sleeping with admirals. Because when I missed holidays due to deployments, relatives called me selfish for choosing career over family. After enough years, silence becomes easier than self-defense. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from Richard. You know what happens when people hear words like Top Gun? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. They stop seeing you as a person. The kitchen clock ticked softly. They either worship you or resent you, sometimes both. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. Trevor still looked unconvinced, but less arrogant now. More uncertain. Like he was trying to recalculate the entire evening in his head. Denise sat beside me carefully. I honestly thought you worked logistics or administration. I did some of that too. But why never correct us? I gave a tired little shrug. Would it have changed anything? Nobody answered because everybody knew the answer. Probably not. The grandchildren wandered halfway into the kitchen, then sensing tension but too young to understand it. Denise's youngest granddaughter looked up at me curiously. Did you really fly jets? I smiled at her. Yes. Were you scared? That question made Richard glance toward me again. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not whether I was important. Not whether I was impressive. Whether I was afraid. All the time I told her honestly. The child frowned. Then why'd you do it? I thought about all the funerals. All the folded flags. All the young pilots pretending bravery before missions. And all the instructors like me who carried the burden of preparing them. Because being scared doesn't mean you quit, I said. The little girl considered that seriously before nodding. Children understand courage better than adults sometimes. Trevor stared down at the kitchen floor for a long moment. Then finally he said the words Richard had been waiting for. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Not polished. Not dramatic. But real enough. And strangely, hearing it didn't make me feel victorious. Just tired. Because apologies arrive quickly at 62 for wounds that began at 16. Later that night, after everyone drifted off toward desserts and coffee, Richard found me alone on the back porch, wrapped in Denise's old wool blanket. Cold rain tapped softly against the deck railing. He stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking. You saved lives, didn't you? I kept looking out into the darkness. I trained people, I answered. He nodded slowly. That means yes. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Richard asked the question nobody in my family had ever bothered asking before. What did it cost you? And for the first time all evening, I didn't know how to answer. Richard's question stayed with me long after the porch conversation ended. What did it cost you? Funny thing is, younger people usually ask what you achieved. Older people eventually learn to ask what it took. By midnight, the house had gone quiet except for the refrigerator humming in Denise's kitchen and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. I couldn't sleep, so I sat alone at the dining room table with a cup of decaf coffee that tasted weak enough to qualify as punishment. The same table where only hours earlier my brother-in-law had laughed at me. Life turns quickly sometimes. I heard footsteps behind me around 1 a.m. Denise appeared wearing a faded University of Virginia sweatshirt and reading glasses she'd probably deny needing during daylight hours. "You always stayed up late?" she asked softly. "Military habit." She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. At 60 years old, my sister still tucked loose hair behind her ear the same nervous way she did at 17. "You know," she finally said, "when we were kids, I used to tell people you'd become a scientist." I smiled faintly. "Why scientist?" "You were always taking radios apart." "That drove Dad crazy." That made her laugh quietly. "He thought you were going to electrocute yourself." The mention of our father settled heavily between us. He'd been gone nearly 12 years now. Heart attack at 74, sudden, quick, the kind of death people call merciful because they don't know what else to say. I stared down into my coffee. "He never forgave me for joining the Navy." Denise looked uncomfortable immediately. "He was old-fashioned." "No," I said gently, "he was disappointed." "There's a difference. People from our parents' generation had very fixed ideas about what daughters were supposed to become. Teachers, nurses, secretaries, wives. Safe. Understandable. I was none of those things. Even at 12 years old, I knew ordinary life would suffocate me. While Denise played house with dolls, I memorized aircraft engines from library books. While other girls hung posters of rock stars, I taped photographs of F-14 Tomcats to my bedroom wall. Dad hated those posters. "Looks ridiculous," he'd mutter whenever relatives visited. Mom tried harder to understand me, but even she seemed exhausted by the effort sometimes. "You don't always have to prove something," she told me once. The trouble was, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Flying simply felt like the first honest thing I'd ever loved. Denise stirred cream into her coffee slowly. "Were you really the only woman in your training class?" "Not the only one," I said. "Just one of very few." "And the men gave you trouble?" I let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to phrase it." She looked genuinely curious now, maybe for the first time in our lives, so I told her. "Not everything. Some stories stay buried for a reason. But enough." I told her about flight school in Pensacola during the early 80s, about instructors who assumed women would wash out within weeks, about classmates who stopped talking when I entered briefing rooms, about the exhaustion. God, the exhaustion. People imagine military aviation as glamorous because of movies. They picture leather jackets and triumphant music. Reality is fluorescent lighting at 4 a.m. while someone twice your size critiques every mistake you make. Reality is studying until your eyes blur because one error in the sky can kill people. Reality is understanding that if you fail, some men will use your failure as evidence women never belonged there in the first place. Denise listened without interrupting. "That sounds miserable." "Some of it was." "Then why stay?" I thought about that carefully. Because quitting would have followed me forever. Because every cruel comment fueled me instead of stopping me. Because once I sat inside a fighter jet for the first time and felt those engines wake beneath me, there was no going back to ordinary life. "You know what the strange part was?" I said quietly. "What?" "The sky was the easy part." Denise frowned slightly. "People were harder." That seemed to hit her. Maybe because she realized she'd been part of that without meaning to. Growing up, Denise had always been the easy daughter to love. She married young, had children, hosted Christmas dinners, remembered birthdays. Meanwhile, I missed funerals because of deployments and forgot anniversaries because I lived by military calendars instead of civilian ones. Families forgive warmth more easily than absence. "You know, Dad used to brag about you eventually," Denise said suddenly. I looked up sharply. "He did." "Not publicly," she smiled sadly, "only when his friends weren't around." That hurt more than I expected. All those years I'd thought he was ashamed of me completely. Denise stared into her coffee. I think he just didn't know how to understand you. That's not the same thing as trying. No, she admitted quietly, it's not. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. Outside cold rain drifted against the windows. You really never married because of the Navy, Denise asked. I smiled a little. That's the simplified version. There had been men. A few good ones. One almost became my husband back in 1989, naval aviator named Scott Brennan, smart, kind, loved jazz music and terrible diner coffee. He died during a training accident over the Atlantic 3 months before the wedding. After that, I stopped imagining permanent things. Denise covered her mouth softly. Oh my God. I'm all right. But even saying those words after 30 years still carried weight. The military teaches you to continue functioning after loss. It does not teach you how to stop carrying it. I had no idea, she whispered. Most people didn't. That was the pattern of my life, really. Invisible sacrifices, invisible grief, invisible service. And maybe that's why Trevor's joke hit harder than he realized. Not because it insulted my rank, because it erased decades of sacrifice with one careless sentence. Denise reached across the table slowly and touched my hand. I'm sorry too, she said. Simple words. Late words. But sincere. I squeezed her hand gently. You were living your life, I told her. So were you. Yes. She looked at me carefully then. And were you happy? That question caught me off guard. Because accomplishment and happiness are not always neighbors. I thought about roaring engines at sunrise, young pilots graduating under my instruction, lonely apartments near bases scattered across America. I thought about funerals, missed holidays, silence. Then I answered honestly. Sometimes. Denise nodded like she understood more than she wanted to. And maybe she did. By morning, nothing in that house had fully healed. But for the first time in decades, the truth had finally entered the room. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. Some routines never leave you even after retirement. For 30 years my life had been measured by alarms in dark rooms, briefing schedules, flight plans, weather reports, and the sound of boots against concrete before dawn. Civilian life still felt slightly unnatural to me sometimes, like I was borrowing someone else's rhythm. Denise's house was quiet when I walked downstairs wearing jeans and an old navy sweatshirt faded nearly gray with age. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt coffee from the automatic timer machine sputtering on the counter. Richard Hayes was already awake. Of course he was. Old Marines rarely sleep late. He sat alone at the table reading a newspaper with the posture of a man who still expected inspection at any moment. He looked up when I entered. Mornin', Commander. I smiled slightly. Retired, Commander? Still counts. He folded the paper carefully. Coffee. I've survived worse. That earned the first real laugh I'd heard from him. I poured myself a mug and sat across from him while soft November light crept through the kitchen windows. For a while we simply existed in companionable silence. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. We don't rush to fill every empty space anymore. Finally Richard spoke. You know Trevor's embarrassed. He'll survive. He's not a bad man. I didn't say he was. And I meant that. Trevor wasn't cruel at his core. Loud, insecure, thoughtless, sometimes yes, but not malicious. Men like Trevor often mistake confidence for volume because nobody ever taught them the difference. Richard rubbed one rough hand along his jaw. He grew up around stories about military service, he said. But stories and sacrifice aren't the same thing. Number. He thinks respecting veterans means bumper stickers and flag pins. I took a sip of coffee. A lot of Americans do. Richard studied me for a long moment. You're angry? That surprised me. Not because he noticed. Because I hadn't admitted it to myself until then. I looked down into the coffee mug. Yes, I said quietly. About Trevor. I shook my head slowly. About how easy it was. He frowned slightly. What was? For everyone to assume I couldn't possibly have done something difficult. The words came out calmer than I felt. That assumption follows women your whole life, especially women my age. I gave a small shrug. People see gray hair and politeness and suddenly decide you were never dangerous. Richard nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. You know, he said, when I first saw you walk in yesterday, I noticed your posture immediately. That's hard to get rid of. No, he replied, but it told me something. I smiled faintly, that I spent too many years standing inspections, that you carried responsibility. Outside, rainwater dripped softly from the gutters. Richard leaned back in his chair. I heard stories about Iron Widow years ago. That old call sign still felt strange in civilian conversation. Most military nicknames sound ridiculous outside their original context. What kind of stories? I asked. That pilots cried after your evaluations. I laughed quietly into my coffee. Some did. And then they got better. Richard grinned. That's what I heard. I stared out the window for a moment, remembering. Young faces. Nervous hands. Cocky lieutenants pretending confidence before carrier qualifications. Kids, really. Most of them barely old enough to rent cars carrying machines worth millions of dollars onto pitching flight decks in darkness. People romanticize military aviation because they never see the fear. I saw it every day. That was my job. You know why instructors get hard? I asked quietly. Richard shook his head once. Because eventually you realize kindness can kill people. The kitchen went still. I continued carefully. If a pilot freezes during training, you correct it. If they get sloppy, you correct it. If they panic under pressure, you force them through it again and again until instinct replaces fear. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Because one day they'll need it for real. Yes. I stared down at my hands. And sometimes they still don't come home. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. There are certain truths veterans recognize without elaboration. Loss is one of them. Around 8 o'clock, the rest of the household slowly came alive upstairs. Footsteps, running water, cabinet doors opening. Then Trevor entered the kitchen. The confidence from yesterday was gone. Good. Embarrassment can be healthy if it teaches humility. He stood awkwardly near the doorway for a second before looking at me. Morning. Morning. Richard quietly folded his newspaper and stood. I'm gonna check the weather outside. The old Marine was giving us privacy. Subtle. Respectful. Trevor sat across from me after his father left. For a moment he looked younger somehow, less polished, less certain. My dad chewed me out for an hour last night, he admitted. I figured. He said I embarrassed myself. I sipped coffee calmly. Did you? He let out a breath through his nose. Probably. That was progress. He rubbed the back of his neck. I honestly thought you were exaggerating. Most people do. No, I mean... He hesitated. You just don't act like someone important. I almost laughed. There it was again. The misunderstanding. What does someone important act like? I asked. Trevor opened his mouth. Closed it again. Exactly. He looked embarrassed. I guess I expected... He searched for words. More ego. That's television, I said. He nodded slowly. Then after a pause, he asked something unexpected. Did people give you hell because you were a woman? I leaned back slightly. Constantly. He looked genuinely disturbed by that. Even after you proved yourself. Especially then. That seemed to shake him. I think for the first time in his life, Trevor realized competence doesn't protect people from prejudice. Sometimes it attracts more of it. He stared down at the kitchen table. My daughter wants to join the Air Force someday. I smiled faintly. Then teach her not to shrink herself for insecure men. He looked up sharply. Not defensive this time. Thoughtful. And suddenly I saw what Richard had probably been hoping for all along. Not punishment. Growth. Denise entered the kitchen carrying laundry a few minutes later and stopped short when she saw us talking peacefully. Well, she said carefully, this is less terrifying than yesterday. Trevor snorted softly. Low bar. She looked at me uncertainly. You okay? I nodded. Yes. And strangely enough, for the first time since arriving, I actually meant it. That afternoon, Denise insisted everybody take a walk after lunch. Fresh air will stop this family from killing each other, she announced. Nobody argued. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the neighborhood washed clean and smelling faintly of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Northern Virginia in late November always reminded me of old photographs, gray skies, bare trees, and people pretending winter wasn't already waiting around the corner. The grandchildren raced ahead down the sidewalk while the adults followed more slowly in pairs. Trevor walked beside me after a while, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. "You know," he said carefully, "I looked you up last night." I glanced sideways at him. "That dangerous, huh?" He gave a nervous laugh. "My dad said if I was going to open my mouth about military service, maybe I should educate myself first." "Wise man." Trevor nodded. "I found articles." That didn't surprise me much. Retirement ceremonies, defense newsletters, aviation publications. Bits and pieces of a career scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs. Most people simply never connected those stories to the quiet woman bringing cranberry sauce to Thanksgiving dinner. "What kind of articles?" I asked. "One about carrier training." He hesitated. "Another mentioned you received some kind of commendation after an accident investigation." I looked ahead toward the children. "That was years ago." "What happened?" The memory arrived instantly. Heat. Smoke. A young pilot screaming into a radio. I exhaled slowly through my nose. "Mechanical failure during training exercises." Trevor waited. "The pilot survived." But barely." He nodded quietly. That was another thing civilians sometimes misunderstood about military life. Survival was not the same thing as escaping unharmed. We walked another 20 feet before Trevor spoke again. "My dad said instructors carry guilt for people who die." I stopped walking for a second. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk in cold wind. "Yes," I said softly. Trevor's expression shifted immediately, like he realized he'd stumbled onto something heavier than curiosity. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "You don't have to apologize for asking." But I appreciated that he cared enough to hesitate. That mattered. We kept walking. Across the street, someone had already put up Christmas lights, even though Thanksgiving wasn't over yet. Red and green reflections shimmered faintly against wet pavement. Trevor glanced toward the grandchildren. "Did you lose students?" There it was. The real question. I kept my eyes forward. "Yes." His face tightened. "How many?" I stopped counting. That answer silenced him completely. Not because the number shocked him, because he finally understood there was one. People over 60 know something younger people often don't. The older you get, the less impressive glory becomes and the more meaningful endurance feels. Trevor had spent years admiring military imagery. Flags. Jets. Uniforms. But now he was beginning to see the human cost underneath the symbolism. We returned to the house about half an hour later. Denise started preparing sandwiches while football commentators shouted from the television. The grandchildren disappeared upstairs with tablets and blankets. Ordinary American family life? And somehow that normalcy made the conversation feel even heavier. Richard found me later in the den studying old framed family photos on the bookshelf. "You were 21 there," he said, pointing toward a picture of me in dress whites. 22. "You looked angry." "I was." He laughed quietly. "Fair enough." I picked up the frame carefully. That photograph had been taken the day I completed advanced flight training. My father had attended the ceremony wearing a stiff gray suit and the expression of a man pretending support because public embarrassment would look worse. "You know what he said afterward?" I asked. Richard shook his head. "He told me maybe now I'd grow out of this phase." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Christ. I think he genuinely believed military service would eventually make me softer somehow. I smiled faintly. Instead, it made me harder. Richard leaned against the bookshelf. "Hard isn't always bad." "No," I admitted, "but it gets lonely." That word hung between us. Lonely. There it was. Not heroic. Not cinematic. Just true. People imagine loneliness as empty apartments and quiet nights. But the deepest loneliness comes from being fundamentally misunderstood by people who've known you your whole life. Denise entered the room carrying folded towels. "You two look serious again." "We're old," Richard replied. "It's our favorite hobby." She smiled before sitting beside me on the couch. "I've been thinking about something," she said carefully. "That sounds dangerous." She nudged my shoulder lightly. "I mean it." I looked at her. "When Mom got sick, Denise hesitated. Why didn't you come sooner? Ah, that wound. The hardest ones are always family questions asked 20 years too late. I was deployed, I answered quietly. You came eventually. Yes, but not until the end. There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made it worse. I stared at the family photo in my hands. The Navy denied my leave twice. Denise blinked. What? We were short pilots. Her face fell completely. You never told me that. What good would it have done? You could have explained. I gave a tired smile. To who, Dad? The relatives already calling me selfish. Denise looked down at her hands. Because she remembered. The whispers during Mom's final weeks. Poor Margaret. One daughter here every day, the other chasing airplanes. Funny how people build entire moral judgments around information they never bothered verifying. I thought you chose not to come, Denise whispered. No, I said gently. I chose not to defend myself anymore. The room went quiet. Richard looked angry now, though not at me. You carried that alone. I shrugged. Military families do it all the time. Denise's eyes filled with tears. Oh God, Evie. I touched her arm softly before she could spiral into guilt. You loved Mom, I said. That mattered more than misunderstandings. But you loved her too. Yes? And there it was again. The truth nobody had ever fully seen. I had sacrificed family moments for service. But I had also sacrificed service for family every chance I could. And somehow still ended up disappointing both worlds sometimes. Trevor appeared quietly in the doorway then. He looked hesitant, like a man realizing the story he mocked was much bigger than his pride. I owe you more than an apology, he said carefully. I looked at him calmly. Maybe. He nodded once. Then after a pause, I think I owe you respect. That one felt different. Because respect offered voluntarily means something. Especially from a man finally learning humility. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Richard Hayes called me on a Tuesday morning while I was reorganizing tools in my garage. Retirement does strange things to people. After decades of operating at high speed, you suddenly find yourself spending 30 minutes deciding where to hang a wrench. Evelyn Richards said over the phone, "You busy Saturday night?" I had plans to aggressively avoid social interaction. He laughed. I'm serious. So am I. That old Marine chuckled again before his tone softened. I'd like you to come to the Veterans Relief Gala. I leaned against the workbench. Richard, hear me out first. I already knew the event he meant. Annual fundraiser outside Arlington for veteran families, military widows, and disabled service members. The kind of formal gathering filled with donated wine, patriotic speeches, and retired officers pretending not to compare ribbons. Not exactly my natural habitat anymore. You'd hate it, he admitted honestly, which is why I know you're the right person to invite. That logic feels questionable. I'm old, humor me. I sighed. Why me? The line went quiet for a second. Because too many loud people get celebrated these days, he said. I'd rather honor someone who actually carried weight. That answer sat heavily in my chest. Nobody had ever spoken about my career that way before. Not publicly. Not personally. After we hung up, I stood alone in the garage for a long time staring at dust floating through cold morning sunlight. Then eventually I whispered the same thing I'd whispered before difficult flights for 30 years. All right. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. I wore a simple black dress with a navy blazer instead of formal military attire. My dress uniform still hung preserved in garment bags upstairs, but I had no interest in becoming a walking museum exhibit for one evening. The gala was held at an old hotel ballroom overlooking the Potomac. Warm lights glowed against polished wood floors, while a jazz trio played softly near the entrance. Mostly older crowd. Gray hair. Slow steps. Veterans. Widows. Children of service members. People who understood sacrifice without needing it explained dramatically. I spotted Denise first near the registration table. She hugged me tightly the moment I walked in. You look beautiful, she said. You look nervous. I am nervous. Why? She smiled weakly. Because Richard refuses to tell me what he's planning. That worried me immediately. Oh no. Before she could answer, Trevor approached from across the room wearing a dark suit and the uncomfortable expression of a man attending his own sentencing hearing. "Hey," he said carefully. "Hey." He shoved his hands into his pockets. "I just wanted to say, thanks for coming." "That bad, huh?" He actually smiled a little. "You have no idea." Richard finally appeared near the ballroom entrance wearing a Marine Corps blazer that somehow made him stand straighter than men 20 years younger. When he saw me, his face softened warmly. "There she is." Richard I warned immediately, "If this evening includes public embarrassment, I'm stealing your cane." "You wouldn't dare." "I flew tactical aircraft off moving ships. Test me." That made him laugh hard enough to cough. The evening itself began quietly enough. Dinner, speeches, charity auctions, stories about military families holding themselves together through deployments and grief and impossible years. Real stories. Not Hollywood nonsense. At some point during dessert, Richard stepped onto the small stage near the ballroom windows and tapped the microphone gently. The room settled. "I know everybody's tired of old men talking," he began, "but indulge me a few minutes more." Polite laughter rolled through the ballroom. Richard looked directly toward me. "Most military celebrations focus on visible leadership," he said. "Decorated commanders, public heroes, the names people recognize." His voice grew quieter. "But some of the most important people in military history are almost completely unknown outside the people they trained." My stomach dropped immediately. "Oh, Richard. You sneaky old Marine." Across the room, Trevor gave me an apologetic look, like he suddenly realized what was happening too late to stop it. Richard continued calmly. "Several weeks ago during Thanksgiving dinner, my son embarrassed himself by mocking a woman who spent decades quietly serving this country." Now the ballroom had gone fully silent. I considered climbing out a nearby window. "She never asked for recognition," Richard said, "which is exactly why she deserves it." Then he looked directly at me. "Commander Evelyn Carter, would you stand, please?" God help me. Slowly, reluctantly, I stood. And then something unexpected happened. Several older men across the ballroom straightened immediately. One man near the back whispered "Iron Widow" under his breath. Another veteran stood up first. Then another. And another. Not applause at first. Recognition. The kind earned quietly over years. A retired pilot near the stage approached me slowly with tears already gathering in his eyes. "You probably don't remember me," he said. I looked carefully at his face. Older now, gray-haired, heavy around the shoulders. But familiar. "Danny Ruiz," I said softly. His laugh broke halfway into a sob. "Jesus Christ, you really do remember." "I remember every pilot who almost killed my blood pressure." The room laughed warmly. Danny wiped his eyes quickly. "You failed me twice during carrier qualification. You were reckless. You saved my life." The ballroom went still again. Danny looked around the room before continuing. "I was 24 years old and thought confidence mattered more than discipline." He swallowed hard. 2 years later, combat hit, and every correction she drilled into me kept me alive. Nobody spoke. Because there are moments older Americans recognize instinctively as sacred. Truth was one of them. Danny looked at me again. "You taught us how to come home." I honestly didn't know what to say to that. After all those years, all those funerals, all those lonely nights wondering whether any of it mattered. Suddenly the weight felt visible. Trevor stepped forward then, his face pale, voice unsteady. "I need to say something too." The room turned toward him. He looked directly at me. "A few weeks ago I made fun of someone because I judged her before understanding her." He swallowed hard. "Truth is, I felt insecure around things I didn't understand." Nobody moved. Trevor took a breath. "I thought being loud made me important." His eyes dropped briefly. I was wrong. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I believed him. The drive home from the gala felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant. Not dramatic. Just quiet. At my age, I'd learned that real closure rarely arrives with fireworks. Most healing enters softly like evening light through old curtains. The highway south was nearly empty. Christmas lights glowed from distant neighborhoods, while old holiday songs drifted through the radio low enough not to interrupt my thoughts. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. And oddly enough, that realization hurt a little. Because once people finally saw me clearly, I couldn't stop wondering how different life might have been if they'd bothered sooner. A few days later, Denise called asking if I'd come for Christmas. Not out of obligation. Not because Richard insisted. Because she wanted me there. That distinction mattered. "I don't want you staying at a hotel this time," she said firmly over the phone. "You're family." Family. Such a simple word for something so complicated. I arrived Christmas Eve carrying a pecan pie from a roadside bakery and fully expecting awkwardness. Instead, Trevor opened the front door wearing an apron dusted with flour. "I'm on biscuit duty," he announced solemnly. "Pray for everyone." I laughed before I could stop myself. And just like that, something shifted. Not erased. Not magically repaired. But softened. The grandchildren swarmed the living room floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and battery-operated chaos. Denise had decorated the house with old-fashioned colored lights instead of the blinding white ones everyone uses now. The whole place felt warmer. More honest somehow. Richard sat near the fireplace wearing a thick cardigan and reading glasses while pretending not to supervise everybody. "You're late," he grumbled as I walked in. "I was avoiding your cooking." That was one time. One traumatic time. He pointed a crooked finger at me. Still disrespectful. The family laughed. And hearing myself inside that laughter instead of outside, it felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Later that evening after dinner, dishes were stacked, and the grandchildren disappeared upstairs with new toys. Trevor handed me a glass of wine and motioned toward the back porch. Cold winter air greeted us outside. The neighborhood glowed softly beneath Christmas lights and quiet suburban darkness. Trevor leaned against the railing. "You know," he said, "I used to think confidence meant always having something to say." I smiled faintly. "That explains a lot." He laughed softly. "Fair." For a moment we simply stood there listening to distant wind moving through bare trees. Then his expression grew serious again. "I owe you another apology." "Trevor." "No, listen." His voice carried none of the defensiveness from Thanksgiving. Only honesty. "I spent years teaching my son to respect veterans." He shook his head slowly. "But I never realized respect also means shutting up long enough to learn who people really are." That one landed deep. Because it wasn't just about military service anymore. It was about life. About aging. About how many older Americans quietly carry histories nobody around them ever notices. I looked out across the neighborhood. "When you get older," I said softly, "people start assuming your story is already finished." Trevor nodded slowly. "But it's not." "Number." He glanced toward me carefully. "You ever regret it?" "The Navy." "Everything." That question deserved honesty. I thought about Scott Brennan. Carrier decks at sunrise. Lonely apartments. Missed funerals. Young pilots surviving because of lessons I screamed into them during training. I thought about my father dying before truly understanding me. And Denise finally trying. I regret some costs, I admitted quietly, but not the service. Trevor looked relieved by that answer for reasons I couldn't entirely understand. Inside the house, laughter echoed faintly through the windows. Warm. Human. Temporary. The older you get, the more you treasure temporary things. When we returned inside, Richard waved me toward the dining table where his grandson Luke sat hunched over a model airplane kit. The boy looked up nervously. "Aunt Evelyn?" he asked. "Yes." His cheeks reddened slightly. "Mom says you flew fighter jets." "I did." He hesitated. "I want to fly someday too." Trevor immediately opened his mouth, then stopped himself. "Growth." I hid a smile. "What kind of flying?" I asked Luke. "Air Force, maybe." He glanced at the little plastic airplane in his hands, or Navy. I pulled out a chair beside him. "Then learn humility early." He blinked. "That's the secret." "One of them." I pointed gently toward the unfinished model airplane. "Machines don't care about ego. The sky doesn't either." Luke listened carefully the way children do when they know an adult is finally giving them the real answer instead of a polished one. "You know what makes people dangerous?" I asked. He shook his head. "Thinking they're too smart to learn." Across the room, Richard smiled quietly into his coffee. The evening slowed after that. Old movies on television. Half-asleep grandchildren under blankets. Denise humming softly in the kitchen while wrapping leftovers in foil. Ordinary moments. And somehow, after a lifetime of extraordinary pressure and responsibility, ordinary finally felt precious. Before bed, I found myself alone at the kitchen sink washing dishes while snow began falling lightly outside the window. Denise walked in carrying another stack of plates. "You don't have to do those," she said. "I know." She stood beside me drying dishes quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I used to think your life was sad." I looked at her gently. "And now?" She smiled through tears gathering in her eyes. "I think it was brave." That nearly broke me. Not because I needed praise, because after 62 years, my sister finally saw me clearly. And maybe that's all most people really want before the end of their story. To be seen truthfully. Not perfectly. Just truthfully. If this story reminded you of someone whose sacrifices went unnoticed for too long, maybe reach out to them while you still can. Sometimes respect arrives late, but it still matters when it comes from the heart. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be remembered too, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this. "Ma'am, I wasn't expecting to find you sitting next to a trash can." The room went completely silent. A moment earlier, people had been laughing. My father had been laughing the loudest. My brother's promotion ceremony was supposed to be the biggest day of his life. Military officers, family friends, local officials, and neighbors had gathered in a banquet hall outside Norfolk, Virginia. The atmosphere had been cheerful, proud, celebratory. Then an admiral walked through the door. Instead of heading toward the stage, he stopped in his tracks and stared directly at me. At the woman sitting beside a trash can. The same woman everyone had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating. I remember the expression on my father's face. Confusion. Then concern. Then something else. Fear. But before I tell you what happened that afternoon, I need to explain how we got there. Because nothing about that moment made sense unless you understood my family. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 42 years old at the time. And for most of my life, I had been the disappointment. At least according to my father. I grew up in a small town outside Richmond, Virginia. My father, Richard Carter, believed strongly in hard work discipline and traditional values. There wasn't anything wrong with that. The problem was that he only seemed to see those qualities in my younger brother, Michael. Michael could do no wrong. If Michael got a B in school, Dad praised him. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. When Michael made varsity football, Dad celebrated for weeks. When I earned a statewide academic scholarship, Dad barely mentioned it. At first, I thought I simply needed to try harder. Then I got older, and I realized the rules were different. Some children grow up trying to earn love. Others grow up learning they never will. I belonged to the second group. My mother did her best to balance things. She loved both of us, but she passed away from cancer when I was 22. After that, whatever restraint existed inside my father seemed to disappear. Michael became his pride. I became his burden. At 18, I enlisted in the Navy, not because I was running away, because I wanted purpose, structure, service. I wanted to build something that belonged to me. Dad's response still echoed in my memory. "Can't make it in college, so you're joining the military." The disappointment in his voice hurt more than I admitted. I spent years proving him wrong. Or maybe proving myself right. Either way, I stopped seeking his approval. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. Part of me never stopped wanting my father to look at me the way he looked at Michael. I just got better at hiding it. Over the next 2 decades, my career took me around the world. Deployments, training commands, disaster relief operations, humanitarian missions, leadership positions. The work mattered. The people mattered. The mission mattered. Recognition never mattered much to me. In fact, I rarely talked about my accomplishments. Partly because military culture teaches humility. Partly because I knew my father wouldn't care anyway. Whenever relatives asked what I did, I usually gave vague answers. "I'm in the Navy." That was enough. Most of them assumed I handled paperwork somewhere. I never corrected them. Life became easier that way. Meanwhile, Michael stayed close to home. He joined public service, built connections, married young, had 2 children, and became the center of every family gathering. Dad loved introducing him. "This is my son." The pride practically glowed from him. I learned to smile through it. Years passed. Then Michael received a significant promotion. A ceremony was scheduled near Norfolk. The entire family was invited. When the invitation arrived, I considered declining. Not because I disliked Michael, Despite everything, I loved my brother. The problem was that family gatherings always left me feeling like an outsider. Still, something told me to go. Maybe loyalty, maybe curiosity, maybe hope. Hope has a funny way of surviving long after it should be dead. The banquet hall sat beside a marina overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. It was a beautiful spring afternoon. Sunlight reflected off the water. Flags fluttered in the breeze. People chatted happily in the parking lot. Everything looked picture perfect. When I walked inside, nobody noticed me. That wasn't unusual. I signed the guest book and found my assigned table. Or tried to. My name wasn't there. I checked again. Nothing. Eventually, I found a handwritten place card near the catering station. Beside a large gray trash can. A folding chair. Not a banquet chair. Not a seat at a table. A folding chair. I honestly thought it was a mistake. Then I heard my father's voice. "Oh, there she is." People turned. Dad grinned. The grin told me everything. This wasn't an accident. He had planned it. I walked over calmly. "Dad, is this supposed to be my seat?" Several guests looked uncomfortable. My father laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A deliberate one. The kind meant to entertain an audience. Then he said the words that would change everything. "Trash belongs with trash." The room exploded with laughter. Some people laughed because they agreed. Others laughed because they felt pressured. A few looked horrified. Michael chuckled awkwardly. Not because he thought it was funny. Because he didn't want to challenge Dad. That hurt more than I expected. For a brief moment I considered leaving. Driving away. Never speaking to any of them again. But something stopped me. Maybe dignity. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe 20 years of military training. Instead, I pulled out the chair. Sat down. Folded my hands. And smiled. The laughter gradually faded. Conversation resumed. Music played. Servers carried trays through the room. Life moved on, at least for everyone else. Inside, old wounds had reopened. Not because of the chair. Not because of the trash can. Because a 42-year-old woman suddenly felt like a little girl again. The daughter who never measured up. The daughter nobody saw. I stared out the window toward the marina. Breathed slowly. And reminded myself of something important. People can only define your worth if you hand them the power to do it. I had learned that lesson years ago. Still, lessons sometimes need repeating. About 20 minutes later, a strange movement caught my attention outside. Several black government SUVs had entered the parking lot. The vehicles parked near the entrance. Security personnel stepped out. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests noticed. Whispers spread. Someone important had arrived. Very important. My father straightened his tie. Michael adjusted his jacket. The master of ceremonies hurried toward the entrance. Everyone assumed the visitor had come to honor my brother. Nobody looked at me. Nobody noticed the small smile forming on my face. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I knew exactly who had just arrived. And I knew the day was about to change forever. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. More like a ripple moving through the room. Conversation slowed. Laughter faded. People turned toward the entrance one by one. The banquet hall had been loud all afternoon. Glasses clinked. Families chatted. Children wandered between tables. The sound of celebration filled every corner. Then the black SUVs arrived. And everything changed. I remained seated beside the trash can. The same folding chair. The same spot my father had chosen for me. Servers continued moving around me carrying trays of iced tea and appetizers. Every now and then someone glanced my way with sympathy. Most quickly looked away. People rarely know what to do when they witness humiliation. My father, meanwhile, was enjoying himself. He stood near the stage, surrounded by relatives and local officials. His chest practically swelled with pride every time someone congratulated Michael. "Your son has done well, Richard." "Thank you." "He should be proud." "Oh, he is?" Dad loved every second of it. Michael stood nearby, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. To his credit, he looked uncomfortable every time his eyes drifted toward my chair. But uncomfortable wasn't the same as courageous. He never came over. Never apologized. Never offered me a seat. Sometimes silence becomes its own form of participation. Outside, vehicle doors opened. Several uniformed personnel stepped onto the sidewalk. Guests began whispering. "Who is that?" "Must be somebody important." "I heard an admiral might attend." My father's eyes lit up. An admiral. For him, that was better than Christmas morning. A high-ranking military officer attending Michael's promotion ceremony would become a story he'd tell for years. The master of ceremonies hurried toward the entrance. Several local officials straightened their jackets. Even Michael looked surprised. Apparently, this guest had not been listed on the official program. I took a slow sip of water and watched. The doors opened. A Navy admiral entered the hall. Tall, distinguished, silver hair, rows of ribbons across his dress uniform. His presence commanded immediate attention, not because he demanded it, because he had earned it. People instinctively stepped aside. Conversation stopped altogether. The admiral nodded politely as he entered. The master of ceremonies approached him immediately. So did several officers. Everyone expected him to move toward the stage, toward Michael, toward the guest of honor. Instead, something unexpected happened. The admiral stopped. Completely stopped. His eyes had found me. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then he changed direction and started walking straight toward the trash can. Toward me? I heard confusion spreading through the crowd. People turned to follow his path. Their expressions changed as they realized where he was going, or rather, who he was going to. The admiral crossed the room. One table, then another, until he stood directly in front of me. I slowly rose to my feet, not because protocol required it, because respect goes both ways. He looked at the folding chair, then at the trash can, then at me. His expression hardened, not with anger toward me, with disbelief toward the situation. Then he spoke. "Ma'am, I wasn't expecting to find you sitting next to a trash can." The room froze. Every conversation died instantly. The words echoed through the hall. People exchanged confused looks. My father blinked. Michael looked stunned. Several officers stared openly. The admiral wasn't merely speaking politely. He was speaking with genuine respect, the kind reserved for someone important. I smiled. "It's fine, Admiral." He glanced at the chair again. "No, ma'am, it isn't." A nervous laugh escaped someone nearby. Nobody joined in. The atmosphere had completely changed. A few minutes earlier, people had been laughing at me. Now they were trying to understand what they had missed. The admiral turned toward a nearby staff member. "Please bring another chair." Immediately. No hesitation. Within seconds, employees were rushing to rearrange seating. The speed of their response only added to the confusion. Dad finally stepped forward. "Admiral, sir." The admiral acknowledged him politely. "Mr. Carter." Dad seemed relieved that the admiral knew his name. He assumed the attention was still connected to Michael. "My son is being recognized today." "Yes," the admiral replied. "I understand." The response sounded courteous, but there was something unusual about it. His focus remained on me. Not on Michael, not on Dad, on me. Michael approached carefully. His smile looked forced. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you." The admiral shook his hand. "Congratulations on your promotion." Michael beamed. For a second, normalcy seemed ready to return. Then the admiral added something that changed everything again. "I'm sure your sister is proud of you." My brother's smile faded slightly. The admiral had deliberately redirected attention back to me. Whispers spread across the room. I could almost hear people thinking, "How does he know her?" A new chair arrived. A proper banquet chair. The admiral personally pulled it out. For me. The room practically stopped breathing. My father looked like he had swallowed a stone. The image alone was shocking. An admiral standing beside a woman everyone had just mocked, treating her with visible respect, offering her a seat. I sat down. The admiral took the chair beside me. Not the seat reserved near the stage, not the VIP table. Beside me. Gasps echoed around the room. Dad's face lost color. For the first time all day, he looked uncertain. The master of ceremonies hurried over. "Sir, we have a table prepared for you." The admiral nodded politely. "I'm comfortable here." The room fell silent again, because everyone understood what that meant. The most important guest in attendance had chosen to sit beside the woman next to the trash can. Several military officers entered the hall behind him. Senior officers, decorated officers, men and women with decades of service. As they spotted the admiral, they approached. Then they noticed me, and their reactions mirrored his. Respect. Recognition. One officer smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Another shook my hand. "It's been too long." A third laughed softly. "I should have known you'd somehow end up stealing the spotlight." The room stared in disbelief. Nobody knew what to say anymore, least of all my father. I could see him replaying the last hour in his head. The joke. The laughter. The chair. The trash can. For the first time, he seemed to realize something was terribly wrong. Not wrong for me. Wrong for him. One of the officers leaned toward another. He thought he was whispering quietly, but in the silence everyone heard him. "Do they really not know who she is?" The question landed like a grenade. Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not yet. And judging by the growing panic on my father's face, the truth was about to become very expensive. For the next several minutes, nobody paid attention to the stage. Nobody cared about the decorations. Nobody cared about the catering. Nobody even cared about Michael's promotion ceremony. The entire room was focused on one question. Who was I? I could almost see it spreading from table to table. The same people who had ignored me an hour earlier were now stealing glances in my direction, whispering, speculating, trying to solve a mystery they hadn't known existed. My father stood frozen near the stage. I had never seen him look so uncertain. Richard Carter was a man who always believed he understood a room. He understood people. He understood status. At least he thought he did. But for the first time in his life, he was completely lost. The Admiral sat beside me calmly. He wasn't trying to create a scene. That was the irony. The scene existed because of how everyone else was reacting. He simply treated me the same way he always had, with professional respect. A server approached nervously. "Would you like anything, Admiral?" He glanced toward me. "Has Commander Carter been served?" The young woman blinked. "Commander." The word spread instantly. "Commander." I heard it bounce across the room like a pebble skipping across water. "Commander Carter." Not Secretary Carter. Not Administrative Assistant Carter. Commander Carter. The server looked at me. I smiled kindly. "I'm fine, thank you." She nodded and hurried away. The whispers intensified. Several guests immediately pulled out their phones. Within minutes, people were searching. Searching my name. Searching military records. Searching professional biographies. Searching anything they could find. My father noticed. "What are they doing?" Nobody answered him. Michael pulled out his own phone. I watched his expression change, then change again, then completely disappear. His eyes moved slowly across the screen. He looked up at me, then back down, then up again, as though he couldn't believe what he was reading. I understood why. Because for 20 years I had deliberately kept my career private. Whenever relatives asked questions, I changed the subject. Whenever people praised me, I redirected attention elsewhere. I had learned long ago that talking about accomplishments rarely changes people's opinions, especially when those opinions are already fixed. But now the information was everywhere, and nobody could ignore it anymore. The first officer standing nearby finally spoke. "Ma'am, are you still overseeing Atlantic Emergency Response Operations?" I nodded. "Among other responsibilities." The officer smiled. "Your hurricane evacuation protocols saved lives all over the East Coast." Several people overheard him. More whispers. More confused looks. My father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Hurricane evacuations. Emergency response. He had no idea what any of that meant. Truthfully, neither did most people in the room. But they understood one thing. It sounded important. Very important. Michael slowly approached my table. For the first time all afternoon, he looked genuinely nervous. "Evelyn." I looked up. "Yes," his voice was careful. "How long have you been a commander?" The question revealed everything. My own brother didn't know. I gave him a small smile. "Several years." His eyes widened. "Several years. Not several months, not recently. Years." The realization hit him hard. The information hadn't been hidden. He had simply never cared enough to ask. That hurt him. I could see it. Because deep down, Michael wasn't cruel. Weak sometimes. Cowardly sometimes. But not cruel. His greatest flaw was allowing our father's opinions to become his own. The Admiral watched quietly. He wasn't enjoying Michael's discomfort. Neither was I. Contrary to what people think, revenge rarely feels as satisfying as imagined. Mostly it feels sad. Sad because the people disappointing you are often the same people you once loved. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 23 years old, fresh off my first deployment. I had returned home after nearly 10 months overseas. Mom had already passed away by then. Dad picked me up at the airport. The ride home lasted almost 2 hours. During those 2 hours, he asked exactly one question about my deployment. One. The rest of the conversation focused on Michael. Michael's new job. Michael's girlfriend. Michael's plans. Michael's future. I remember staring out the passenger window wondering why I kept expecting things to change. That had been nearly 20 years earlier. And somehow I still hadn't fully learned. Back in the present, another officer approached. Then another. Then another. Each greeting made the atmosphere more uncomfortable. Not because they were praising me, because they clearly knew me, respected me, valued me. One senior officer laughed warmly. "Evelyn, I still tell people about that evacuation operation in North Carolina. Several heads turned. What evacuation? The officer smiled. 300 civilians trapped during flood conditions. He shook his head. Most people would have waited for better weather. I immediately interrupted. It wasn't just me. But he ignored the correction. You made the call. The room listened. Nobody touched their food anymore. Nobody cared about lunch. My father finally stepped forward. His patience had reached its limit. What exactly is going on here? The room became quiet. The Admiral looked at him calmly. There seems to be some confusion. My father forced a laugh. I think that's fair to say. The Admiral nodded, then spoke carefully. Your daughter is one of the most respected officers currently serving in her field. My father laughed again. Only this time it sounded nervous, almost desperate. Come on. Nobody joined his laughter. Nobody. The silence was brutal. The Admiral didn't smile. Neither did the officers, because none of them considered the statement extraordinary. To them it was simply true. For the first time all day my father looked genuinely shaken. A few tables away I noticed several guests reading articles on their phones. One woman covered her mouth. Another stared openly at me. A retired Navy veteran stood slowly from his chair. He had been sitting quietly in the back of the room. Now he looked directly at me. Recognition flashed across his face. I know that name. The room turned toward him. The elderly veteran pointed gently. You were the officer who coordinated relief operations after Hurricane Florence. I nodded. The veteran's eyes softened. My granddaughter was evacuated because of those efforts. Silence. Absolute silence. The old man placed a hand over his heart. Thank you. I didn't know what to say. So I simply nodded. But I noticed something happening nearby. My father's shoulders had begun to sag. The confidence that carried him through the afternoon was disappearing. Because the story he had told himself for years was collapsing. The disappointing daughter. The successful son. The family hierarchy. All of it. Then, before anyone could speak again, the master of ceremonies rushed back onto the stage. His face looked pale. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and made an announcement nobody expected. Before we continue with today's promotion ceremony, we have been authorized to conduct a special recognition presentation. Confused murmurs filled the room. Michael frowned. My father blinked. The master of ceremonies looked directly at me, then smiled. And the individual being recognized today is Commander Evelyn Carter. The room exploded with shock, and the biggest surprise of the day was still yet to come. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The master of ceremonies stood at the podium holding a folder, while more than 100 guests stared at me. Commander Evelyn Carter. The name seemed to hang in the air. My brother looked stunned. My father looked as if the floor had vanished beneath him. And honestly, part of me wished the ceremony would simply end. I never enjoyed being the center of attention. That might sound strange after everything that happened, but it was true. The Navy had taught me many things over the years. One of them was that real leadership rarely seeks applause. The mission comes first. The people come first. Recognition comes last. Unfortunately, life doesn't always cooperate with our preferences. The master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event includes an unexpected but very special recognition. The room remained silent. Everyone was listening now. Every single person. I glanced toward the Admiral. He gave me a reassuring nod. Then he quietly whispered, "You've earned this." I smiled politely, but inside I felt something entirely different. Nervous. Not because of the recognition, because of my father. A small part of me still worried about what this would do to him. Even after everything. Even after the trash can. Even after the laughter. Children never completely stop caring what their parents think. The master of ceremonies continued. Commander Evelyn Carter has spent more than 2 decades serving the United States Navy with distinction. Several large monitors positioned around the room suddenly came to life. A slideshow appeared. The first photograph showed me at 20 years old. Young, thin, standing awkwardly beside a training instructor. A few relatives gasped. Many had never seen the picture. The second photo appeared. Then the third. Then dozens more. Deployments. Command centers. Disaster response operations, humanitarian missions, rescue efforts, military ceremonies, places my family had never asked about, places I had never talked about. The room watched quietly. The master of ceremonies read from the official record. Commander Carter has led multiple large-scale emergency response operations throughout the Atlantic region. Another image appeared. Floodwaters, rescue helicopters, emergency shelters. The room grew even quieter. She has coordinated evacuation efforts involving thousands of civilians during hurricanes and natural disasters. My father stared at the screen. His expression changed with every photograph. I could almost see the memories forming inside his head. The birthdays he missed, the phone calls he rushed through, the conversations he never had, years he never bothered to understand. The presenter continued. Her leadership during several emergency operations has been recognized at both regional and national levels. The audience applauded softly. I wished they wouldn't. Recognition always feels strange when so many people contributed. No operation is ever accomplished alone. No mission belongs to one person. But there was no stopping the ceremony now. A video began playing. Several military personnel appeared on screen. One by one they spoke. A senior chief described a hurricane evacuation. A Coast Guard officer discussed joint rescue operations. A civilian emergency coordinator talked about disaster relief efforts. None of them spoke about medals. None of them spoke about rank. They talked about people, families, lives saved, communities protected, the things that actually mattered. As the video played, I noticed something happening at my father's table. Nobody was speaking to him anymore. Not because they were angry, because they were processing. Many had laughed earlier. Now they were realizing exactly who they had laughed at. Across the room, Michael sat completely still. His eyes never left the screen. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. A sailor appeared in the video. Young. Probably 22. Maybe 23. He looked directly into the camera. I was a brand new officer when I first worked under Commander Carter. He smiled. I thought leadership meant being the smartest person in the room. Several guests chuckled. The young officer continued. She taught me that leadership means taking responsibility when things go wrong and giving credit away when things go right. I looked down, embarrassed. The room listened carefully. The young man smiled again. Everything I know about taking care of people came from her. The video ended. The applause this time was louder, much louder. I wished my mother could have seen it. Not the recognition, the respect. She would have been proud. The master of ceremonies stepped away from the podium. Then something unexpected happened. 3 senior officers approached the stage. Each carried a folder. One carried a presentation case. The audience immediately sensed this wasn't routine. The first officer began speaking. He described a recent operation, an operation that had never appeared in the news. Most military work doesn't. A dangerous situation, complicated logistics, lives at risk. The details remained limited for security reasons, but the outcome was clear. A serious disaster had been prevented. The officer paused. Commander Carter's leadership was instrumental in the success of that mission. Then another officer spoke. Then another. Each described my work. Not dramatically, not theatrically, professionally, respectfully. The effect was overwhelming. Because these were not compliments from family, not favors, not politics. These were assessments from people who had spent decades judging performance, and they all reached the same conclusion. I had done my job well, very well. When the final speaker finished, the room rose to its feet, a standing ovation. I honestly didn't know where to look. My face felt warm. My hands trembled slightly. Not from pride, from emotion. Because for the first time in my life, I was standing in front of my family exactly as I was. Not underestimated, not dismissed, not ignored, simply seen. Then came the biggest misunderstanding of the afternoon. One of the local officials leaned toward another guest. His whisper carried farther than he intended. Well, now we know why the Admiral is here. Several people nodded. They assumed the answer was obvious. I heard another whisper. She's his wife. More nods. The room seemed relieved. The mystery had been solved. Or so they thought. The Admiral slowly stood. He approached the podium. The audience immediately quieted. He looked across the room, then directly at my father. My wife is indeed seated in this room today. Several guests smiled knowingly. The Admiral continued. But I would like to correct a misunderstanding. The smiles disappeared. His voice remained calm, measured, professional. I am not here because Commander Carter is married to me. The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop. The Admiral glanced toward me, then back toward the audience. I am here because I have spent years watching one of the finest officers I have ever known serve her country with extraordinary integrity. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Admiral's next words landed like thunder. I respect her because she earned it. My father's face turned white, completely white. And for the first time all afternoon I saw genuine shame in his eyes. Not embarrassment, not discomfort, shame. Because suddenly he understood something devastating. Everything he admired in Michael, everything he celebrated, everything he valued, his daughter had achieved in abundance. And he had never even bothered to look. A few minutes later, while the applause continued around the room, I noticed movement near the exit. My father was quietly walking away, alone, head lowered, shoulders slumped. No one stopped him. No one called after him. He disappeared through the doors without saying a word. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Watching him leave hurt far more than watching him laugh. The applause continued long after my father left the room. People shook my hand. Military officers offered congratulations. Former colleagues shared stories. Guests who had ignored me all afternoon suddenly wanted to talk. But my attention kept drifting toward the exit, toward the door my father had walked through. The truth was, I hadn't come to the ceremony hoping for revenge. I know that's probably hard to believe, especially after everything that happened. The trash can, the joke, the laughter, the humiliation. But revenge had never been my goal. If it had been, I would have revealed my career years ago. I would have corrected people. I would have demanded recognition. Instead, I spent most of my adult life doing the opposite. Keeping quiet. Moving forward. Building a life without waiting for my family's approval. At least that was what I told myself. Yet, as I stood there accepting congratulations, I realized something uncomfortable. Part of me had never stopped hoping. Hoping my father would someday see me. Not Commander Carter. Not the officer. Not the decorated veteran. Just his daughter. The daughter he had overlooked for most of her life. The ceremony ended about an hour later. Guests gradually departed. Tables emptied. The banquet hall grew quieter. The Admiral and I lingered behind, speaking with a few officers. Eventually, Michael approached. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. There were dark circles beneath his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "I'm sorry." Simple words, but sincere. I could hear it. I looked at him carefully. "For what?" He swallowed. "For a lot of things." His eyes dropped toward the floor. "I should have said something when Dad put you beside the trash can." I remained silent. He continued. "I should have said something years ago." That one hurt. Because it was true. Not just today. Years. Decades. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. "I always knew he treated us differently." His voice grew quieter. "I just didn't want to admit it." There it was. The truth. Not cruelty. Cowardice. A different problem. But still a problem. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying it." He looked relieved. Not forgiven, just relieved. As though carrying that truth had become exhausting. Then he asked a question. One I'd never expected. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I smiled sadly. "Tell you what?" "Any of it." He gestured vaguely. "The Navy, the promotions, the operations, everything." I thought about that. The answer wasn't simple. Finally, I shrugged. Nobody ever asked. Michael looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Because he knew it was true. Nobody had asked. Not really. Not in a meaningful way. The conversation ended there. Neither of us knew what else to say. Some wounds require more than one afternoon to heal. That evening, I drove alone to a small cemetery outside Richmond. The sun was beginning to set. The air felt cool, peaceful. I parked near the entrance and carried a small bouquet of flowers. My mother's grave sat beneath a large oak tree, the same tree she loved when she was alive. I placed the flowers beside the headstone, then sat quietly. For a long time, I simply stared at her name. The years disappear in places like that. You stop feeling 42. You stop feeling important. You stop feeling successful. You become a child again, a daughter, someone who misses her mother. "I wish you'd been there today." The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them aloud. A breeze moved through the trees. Leaves rustled softly overhead. I smiled. Mom would have known exactly what to say. She always did. The Admiral arrived a few minutes later. He found me sitting on the grass. Neither of us spoke immediately. After all these years together, silence had become comfortable. Eventually, he sat beside me. "You okay?" I nodded, then shook my head, then laughed softly. "Maybe," he smiled. "That's honest." We sat quietly, watching the sunset, listening to birds settle into the trees. Finally, I told him what I had been thinking. I thought today would feel better. He understood immediately. The ceremony, the reveal. The Admiral nodded. I continued. "I thought maybe it would fix something. His expression softened. But it didn't. I looked toward my mother's grave. No. He waited. Patient as always. Eventually I found the words. I spent years thinking that if my father finally saw what I'd accomplished, everything would make sense. The Admiral sighed gently. And now, I smiled sadly, now I know it doesn't work that way. He placed a hand over mine. No accomplishment heals an old wound by itself. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never offered easy answers, only honest ones. The next morning my father sat alone in his house. I didn't know it then, but Michael would later tell me what happened. After returning home, Dad couldn't sleep. He wandered through old boxes stored in the attic. Photographs, documents, memories. Eventually he found something he hadn't seen in years. A small cardboard box labeled Evelyn. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters I had written throughout my career. Letters I never mailed. Most were written during deployments. Lonely nights. Long missions. Difficult assignments. Not official reports. Personal thoughts. The things a daughter wishes she could tell her father. In one letter I described missing home. In another I talked about wishing Mom were still alive. In another I admitted something I had never said aloud. I wanted Dad to be proud of me. Apparently he read every single one after another, hour after hour, alone. By sunrise he was crying. Michael told me later it was the first time he had ever seen our father cry. Not when Mom died. Not during hardships. Not during failures. Never. But that morning he did. Because for the first time he wasn't looking at rank, or achievements, or promotions. He was looking at the lonely little girl hidden behind all of them, and finally seeing her. The next morning shortly after breakfast, there was a knock on my hotel room door. I opened it. My father stood outside. His eyes were red. His shoulders looked older, smaller somehow. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "Evelyn, could we talk?" And for the first time in my life, I heard humility in his voice. For a few seconds I simply stared at him. The man standing outside my hotel room barely resembled the father I had known most of my life. The Richard Carter I grew up with always seemed larger than life. Confident, opinionated, certain. Certain he was right. Certain he understood people. Certain he knew what mattered. The man standing before me now looked tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired, as though something heavy had finally caught up with him. "Evelyn, could we talk?" His voice was quiet. Careful, almost fragile. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly. The room suddenly felt very small. I sat near the window. He chose the chair across from me. For several moments neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was simply crowded with 40 years of unfinished conversations. Finally my father took a deep breath. "I don't know where to start." I looked at him. "Then start with the truth." He nodded. A slow, painful nod. Then he surprised me. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame stress. He didn't blame grief. He didn't blame my mother's death. He didn't blame anyone. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "I failed you." The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Devastating. My father swallowed hard. "I failed you as a father." Tears filled his eyes. "I've been sitting with that all night." I remained silent. Not because I was angry. Because I needed to hear everything. For once. The whole truth. "I spent years convincing myself I was treating you fairly." His voice cracked. "But I wasn't." He shook his head. "I favored Michael." Another pause. "I always favored Michael." The honesty hurt. But strangely it also brought relief. There is something powerful about hearing a truth finally spoken aloud. Especially one you've carried alone for decades. Dad continued. "I don't even know when it started." He stared down at his hands. "Maybe because he reminded me of myself." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe because I understood him better." Another pause. "Maybe because I was blind." I watched him carefully. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeing my father defend himself. I was watching him confront himself. And those are very different things. His eyes lifted toward mine. "When your mother died, I got worse." I nodded slowly. We both knew it. Neither of us had ever said it, but we both knew. I poured everything into Michael. His voice grew softer. "And I assumed you'd be okay." A tear rolled down his cheek. "I thought you were strong enough not to need me." That one hit hard. Because it explained so much. Not everything, but enough. Many people mistake strength for invulnerability. They see the child who survives, the child who adapts, the child who carries on, and they assume that child doesn't hurt. But strength doesn't eliminate pain. It simply hides it. My father wiped his eyes. Then he said something I never expected. I read your letters. I froze. The letters. For a moment I couldn't speak. He nodded. Every one of them. His voice broke completely. I should have read them years ago. I looked away, suddenly afraid I might cry too. Those letters contained parts of me nobody had ever seen. Fear, loneliness, hope, heartbreak. The things I never said out loud. My father shook his head. You kept reaching for me. Another tear. And I wasn't there. The room fell silent again. Outside traffic moved along the street below. Inside time seemed to stop. Eventually I asked the question that mattered most. Why? Dad looked confused. Why what? Why was I never enough? The words escaped before I could stop them. 40 years. One question. His face collapsed. The answer came immediately. No. He shook his head desperately. No, Evelyn? More tears. You were always enough. I stared at him. He continued. The problem wasn't you. Another pause. It was me. The room became very quiet. Because deep down I think both of us had waited decades for those words. The problem wasn't you. Not every wound can be healed. But some wounds finally stopped bleeding. A few minutes later another knock sounded at the door. Michael. I opened it. He looked nervous. Almost as nervous as Dad. When he entered and saw our father crying, his expression changed immediately. The three of us sat together. Awkwardly at first. Then honestly, for the next hour we talked. Really talked. Maybe for the first time in our lives. Michael admitted things too. He admitted he enjoyed being the favorite. He admitted he stayed silent when he should have spoken. He admitted he sometimes accepted praise that belonged to both of us. None of it was easy. None of it erased the past. But it mattered. Because healing begins where honesty begins. Eventually Michael looked at me and said, I don't want to lose my sister. I smiled through tears. Then don't. That simple. That complicated. By noon something had changed. Not perfectly. Not magically. But genuinely, the walls we'd spent decades building had begun to crack. A few months later, another family gathering took place. Nothing formal. No ceremonies. No promotions. No speeches. Just a Sunday dinner. The kind families have every day across America. When I arrived, my father met me at the door. He hugged me, then led me inside. There beside his chair was a place setting. My place setting. He smiled. Saved you a seat. Such a small gesture. Most people would never notice. But I did. Because all those years ago I had wanted a seat at the table. Not because of status, not because of recognition. Because I wanted to belong. And finally I did. Not because I became successful. Not because I earned medals. Not because an admiral defended me. But because the truth finally entered the room. And once the truth arrives, healing becomes possible. Looking back now, the greatest victory wasn't watching my father feel embarrassed. It wasn't seeing guests shocked. It wasn't hearing applause. The greatest victory was discovering that revenge doesn't always mean destroying someone. Sometimes it means allowing them to see what they've done, and giving them the chance to become better. My father can never give me back the years we lost. Neither of us can change the past, but we can choose what happens next. And sometimes that's enough. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never assume you know someone's worth based on where they're sitting. You never know what battles they've fought. You never know what sacrifices they've made. And you never know how deeply a kind word or a cruel one can stay with them for a lifetime. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to reach out to someone you love. Tell them what they mean to you while you still can. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, remember this. Your value has never depended on someone else's ability to recognize it. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if stories like this remind you of the things that truly matter, family forgiveness and second chances, I hope you'll share the story with someone who may need to hear it